Timeless Assassin by author Raj_Shah_7152. Chapter 931-960. Chapter 931 Prophecies and Fate. The Land of Fate, Leo's POV. Seeing Leo's confused expression, Lady Destiny elaborated on what she meant when she referenced the cult's great prophecy. The cult's great prophecy. The true one. She paused, giving the words time to settle before continuing. It goes something like this. Her gaze lifted toward the sky as she spoke. When silence reigns and stars grow dim. When gods grow frail and light grows thin, his blood will stir, his kin will rise. With shadowed blade and ageless eyes. From fractured time and shattered glass. Will walk the air of what once was. The timeless assassin's whispered breath. Will break the chains of godless death. No banners raised, no armies sworn. He'll walk alone where light is torn. Yet empires vast will bow and break, as heavens tremble, as kingdoms quake. No throne shall stand, no crown remain, when his descendant walks again. For gods will weep, and time will break. When vengeance stirs and heavens quake. Silence followed. Leo's eyes narrowed slightly as he replayed the verses in his mind, comparing them against memory, against the fragments he had read, inside the cult before nodding once in acknowledgement. I've indeed heard it before, he said, as a small, knowing smile curved on Lady Destiny's lips. It is not easy to imprint a prophecy into the collective consciousness of billions of souls, she said, as she took a single step forward towards Leo. But when enough of them start to believe, a prophecy ceases to be merely words and instead becomes a self-fulfilling destiny. She explained before giggling mischievously, as if to show how proud she was of her work. Across the eons since the universe has been created, I've dropped such prophecies into the collective consciousness of sentient creatures, to ensure that the universe survives its own cycles of arrogance, decay, and rebirth. She began, as she started to stroll casually around Leo. History, when left unchecked, has a tendency to repeat itself. When the lessons of the past are forgotten, the same mistakes resurface again and again, dressed in different names and justified by different beliefs, yet always leading to the same conclusions. Power centralizes. Arrogance follows. Gods overreach. Civilizations decay. And the universe suffers until it forgets why it suffered in the first place, she explained before pausing, as she let Leo process the weight behind those words before continuing. That is how dread loops are born. They emerge from forgetfulness, from civilizations losing sight of why past suffering occurred in the first place. And hence, to prevent stagnation from becoming permanent, I intervene. I introduce a prophecy for the age. A possibility seeded into the collective consciousness that grants its chosen protagonist the chance to see beyond the assumptions of their time, to act where others hesitate, and to choose differently when history pushes them towards familiar mistakes. She explained, as she looked into Leo's eyes expectantly, as if implying, and you're the chosen protagonist now, however, never saying it explicitly. Out of the 7 ages that have passed since the universe's birth, the cycle of history has only been truly broken once. That singular fracture reshaped everything. Progress accelerated. Technology advanced. The lives of common people improved within generations rather than millennia. And since that moment, despite factions rising and falling, despite eras changing their names and banners, the universe has remained fundamentally the same place. Different actors. The same script. The words lingered between them, heavy with implication, as Leo felt the weight of the age slowly tilt toward him. Not to erase karma, and not to defy it, but to give history a chance to confront it consciously. For that is how my prophecies work. They do not remove consequences, but rather concentrate them. She explained, as Leo suddenly felt as though the air he was breathing at this moment became much heavier than before even though nothing around them changed. When a prophecy is believed, every choice made in pursuit of that prophecy carries greater weight, greater risk, and greater consequence. It's like the universe watches every action linked to it more closely. And hence the price for any deviation becomes steeper. Her expression softened, though the meaning of her words did not. I can see from your thoughts that you finally have an idea as to where I'm going with this explanation. So let me remove the last layer of ambiguity and leave no space for misinterpretation. You are not outside karma. You are not above it. And you are not protected from it. She held his gaze without blinking. If anything, you are closer to it than anyone else alive. Every step you take will accumulate consequence faster. Every victory will demand a price sooner. Every compromise you make will echo louder than it would for another soul. Karma will not wait generations to collect from you. It will collect immediately, precisely, and without mercy. Her words did not accuse him. They simply were. That is the burden of being a divergence point, she continued. When history is offered a chance to change, the universe tightens its accounting. There is no room for excess, no tolerance for waste. Balance must be paid for in real time, she said as she let out a quiet breath. You have been given a role that allows the cycle to be confronted rather than repeated, but whether it breaks or reinforces the loop depends entirely on how you carry that weight. For although prophecy opens the door, your choice is ultimately what decides what lays beyond it. Her expression softened, though the gravity of her words did not. You may fail, she said plainly. Many before you have. And when that happens, karma simply resumes its work, and history continues as it always has, grinding forward, fed by lives and regrets. She took a small step back, giving him space. But if you succeed, if you truly resolve what others only delayed. The reflected sky beneath them rippled once. Then this age will not merely end differently, Lady Destiny finished. It will move forward. Chapter 932. A dirty warning. The Land of Fate, Leo's POV. Listening to Lady Destiny's words, Leo could not help but ponder about the deeper implications behind the suggestions she was making. However, no matter how hard he thought, he could not clearly see how any of it would truly affect his life. I understand that karma and destiny are intertwined, and that to bear a great destiny means that an equal price must be paid as karma. However, which precise choice is she trying to influence? He wondered, as Lady Destiny, having read his thoughts, continued without softening her words. When your ancestor walked this path, he did not do so ignorantly, as the timeless assassin understood exactly what it meant to challenge history, to push against karma rather than flow with it, and yet he chose to proceed regardless, convinced that the cycle of suffering had to break at some point, no matter the cost. There was no judgment in her words, only record. He built something unprecedented, an organization that refused divine authority, rejected historical inertia, and sought to force the universe into progression rather than repetition, and for a time, that attempt genuinely succeeded. Her gaze remained fixed on Leo. Gods were destabilized, systems that had endured entire ages were broken, and power structures collapsed under pressure they were never designed to withstand. She tilted her head slightly. But disruption is not the same as resolution. And if you walk the same path as your ancestor, Lady Destiny said, her voice steady and unyielding, there exists a very real possibility that you will die the same way. The words struck deep. Betrayed, outnumbered, and condemned by the very bonds you believed would endure. She warned, as for the first time since entering the Land of Fate, Leo truly felt the weight of the road in front of him. Lady Destiny did not press him, nor did she attempt to steer him, instead offering him something far more dangerous than instruction. A choice. So tell me, Leo Skyshard, what will you do? Her eyes searched his face. Will you attempt to fulfill the prophecy, fully aware of the cost it demands, or will you step aside, abandon the role, and allow history to select another protagonist to bear the weight instead? She asked, as the dreamscape began to fade, the colors above him fracturing like glass under pressure, while the mirrored water beneath his feet splintered into 1,000 reflections that no longer aligned, as though the Land of Fate itself had decided that the conversation had reached its natural end. Lady Destiny's form was the first to break apart. Her shifting silhouette blurred, stretched, and then dispersed into drifting motes of light that dissolved into the fractured sky, leaving Leo standing alone as the horizon folded inward on itself. The rainbow above him shattered next. Cracks raced across the sky like fault lines, light leaking through the fractures as the world lost cohesion, the reflection beneath his feet breaking into ripples that no longer obeyed direction or depth. The ground vanished, and then, Leo was alone, suspended in nothing. No colors, no reflections, no voice, only thought. The last words she had spoken echoed inside his mind with uncomfortable clarity. Betrayed by your own flesh and blood. Leo clenched his jaw as the phrase replayed itself, each repetition digging deeper than the last. What does that even mean? The question surfaced instinctively, followed by another that made his chest tighten. Will one of my sons betray me, just like Caliph betrayed the timeless assassin. The thought unsettled him far more than any battlefield ever had. Caleb, Myron. Their faces surfaced in his mind, young, unshaped by the world. Untouched by ambition, fear, or ideology, and the idea of associating betrayal with them felt wrong on a fundamental level, like forcing poison into something still pure. They're children. The realization steadied him slightly. They're innocent. And yet, the unease lingered. Because Destiny's warning had not been about inevitability. It had been about belief. Leo exhaled slowly as another realization settled in. If I start looking at them with suspicion instead of certainty. The thought trailed off before completing itself, because he already understood where it led. Thinking that they were eventually going to betray him, planted the seed of distrust into his mind early, causing him to subconsciously distance himself from his children, until the love between them was eroded through caution. In the end, the prophecy would be fulfilled not because it was unavoidable, but because it was believed in strongly enough to shape every choice around it. That's the trick. The realization came quietly, but it carried weight. That's how prophecy becomes destiny. Not through force or divine command, but through fear shaping behavior, through anticipation altering trust, through people acting in ways that slowly construct the outcome they were trying to avoid. No, I won't be playing your dirty game. You will not turn me against my own flesh and blood. He concluded with certainty, as he felt his mind returning to his own body. Chapter 933 The True War. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit. After many hours of grueling battle, the cult finally managed to break through the second layer of the Chakravya in full, the last remaining Grandmaster tier warriors being slaughtered where they stood as the cult army surged forward through collapsing formations. Blood-soaked ground, and shattered defensive lines, momentum carrying them onward while exhaustion clung to every step they took. The second ring did not fall cleanly. It unraveled. Grandmaster formations that had once stood firm under pressure fractured unevenly as cult units pressed from multiple angles, shield walls buckling under sustained impact while assassins and vanguard elites punched through weakened points, forcing the defenders into reactive retreats that quickly devolved into routes as command cohesion disintegrated. Bodies piled where lines had stood minutes earlier, and through this chaos the cult army marched on. Step, step, tremble, sound of commands. For a while, the cult army breezed through the empty gap between the second and third ring of the Chakravya, yet despite the important breakthrough, no celebration followed. The cult commanders understood that they were significantly behind schedule by now, since they were now 12 minutes behind Leo's determined target, which was why, even though a rush of satisfaction passed through their veins for pushing through the second ring, no actual celebration followed, as they did not so much as let out a yelp of cheer, and instead only asked their units to push forward without delay. Onwards. Don't stop now, men. We are halfway there. They shouted, as eventually the cult vanguard reached the third ring, where the opposing transcendent tier warriors stepped forward in disciplined synchronization, their combined auras layering together until the air itself felt heavier, distorted, and resistant, as if reality had begun pushing back against the cult's advance. Come, you bastards. Come to daddy. You may have gotten through till here, but this is where you die. The third ring soldiers shouted, as unlike the previous layers, this ring did not rely on mass or attrition. It relied on dominance. Each warrior standing within it carried decades of battle experience, and were all high-ranking military officers themselves, with most having also received some form of military honor through their tenure. They were the righteous faction's elite forces, the veterans who were only a step below the righteous commanders but were still an important part of the righteous army. As approaching them, the cult vanguard slowed instinctively out of fear. Gulp. Clench. The already tired cult soldiers clenched their weapons hard, as they prepared for the inevitable first clash. However, before they could do so, a massive giant frog flew from over their heads and landed a few meters behind enemy formation. Thud. Clang. Shing. Boom. The battlefield around him erupted into chaos as steel rang against his twin swords, while energy techniques detonated against his body in blinding flashes, only to cause minimal damage. Acid spit. Sizzle. To counter them, Dumpy sprayed corrosive acid outward in wide arcs that melted armor and flesh alike as he tore into the surrounding formations with savage precision. Screams. Chaos. Elite righteous soldiers fell in clusters as he moved, his bulk transforming into a moving epicenter of devastation that seized control of the immediate area through sheer violence, swords tearing through defenses while acid spits and body slams scattered warriors like debris caught in a storm. Hundreds died within moments, while scores more were forced to reposition. For a brief span of time, Dumpy dominated the space entirely. Yet even as he carved a pocket of ruin around the edge of the third ring, the broader battlefield refused to bend with him, because while Dumpy could annihilate everything within reach, the Chakravya did not depend on any single node to function. Its strength lay in scale. Its lethality lay in coordination. And the Transcendent Tier defenders adjusted quickly. Wide area techniques began firing in overlapping sequences as coordinated AoE attacks surged outward, arcs of destructive force sweeping across the battlefield and slamming into the advancing cult vanguard as entire sections were blown apart. Boom, slash, plop. Bodies were blown apart as cult soldiers were hurled backward. Armor imploding and spines breaking midair, as the cult army experienced strength far beyond what Master or Grandmaster tier opponents could produce. Shing. Stop. The advance ground to a halt. Shields remained locked in a tussle of strength, as the cult army failed to push through. Arg, my arm. They cut off my arm. Screams rose from the front lines, raw and unfiltered, carrying backward through the ranks, as the cult soldiers started to fall in droves for the first time since the war began. Up until this point, the cult army had been advancing with calculated brutality, their numerical superiority and disciplined coordination allowing them to grind through Master and Grandmaster opposition with ruthless efficiency, even as casualties mounted. However, that paradigm seemed to shatter the moment they faced the third ring in earnest. The Transcendents did not yield ground. They erased it. Every step forward now demanded disproportionate cost as exhaustion compounded, stamina reserves dipped into dangerous thresholds, and command decisions became increasingly reactive rather than proactive, the battlefield transforming from controlled advance into a sustained contest of endurance. Dumpy continued rampaging within enemy lines, drawing fire, breaking formations, and forcing local collapses wherever he moved, yet from a macro perspective, his devastation was insufficient to tip the balance, because the Chakravya absorbed localized chaos without losing structural integrity. The cult army needed space. They needed momentum, and neither could be seized by a single entity, no matter how destructive. As Transcendent tiered techniques continued detonating in layered waves and the cult vanguard struggled to stabilize under escalating pressure, it became painfully clear that the war had crossed an irreversible threshold. This was no longer about breaking defenses. This was about survival under overwhelming force. And as blood soaked deeper into the ruined ground and the third ring held firm against the cult's advance, the truth settled across the battlefield with crushing inevitability. The true war had finally begun. Chapter 934 Waking Up. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit, Soren's POV. Clang. Parry. Block. Soren successfully defended himself against yet another wave of attacks from Helmuth, as the cult master remained firmly committed to intense defense, refusing to capitalize on any opening no matter how briefly it appeared. Come on now. You're taking all the fun out of this. What's your plan here? Do you want to frustrate me to the point I offer you a free swing? Helmuth asked, leaning forward as he pointed directly toward his own chin. Come, hit me here, you son of a bitch. Come show some spirit. I swear I won't move or block the attack. Helmuth offered, attempting to bait Soren into switching to offense by any means necessary, however the cult master refused to budge. He kept his feet planted firmly and his stance unwaveringly defensive, as he fully accepted his role as the weaker fighter in this exchange and made no attempt to seize the initiative. Right now, he knew that the priority was to stall for time and conserve energy. And hence, he did exactly that. Meanwhile, outside the heart of the Chakravya, within the innermost ring formed by 5 gods and 3 demigods, the pressure began mounting slowly but relentlessly. With both the first and second rings annihilated, a significant portion of the formation's burden had shifted inward, forcing those holding the innermost ring to bear the strain most directly. Pant. Gulp. Sharp exhale. Raymond, Clarence, and Terence were affected the worst, as while they carried the same load as the gods beside them, they were still a tier weaker. By the cosmos, this load is unbearable. The last time I pushed my mind and body this hard was when I ascended from monarch to demigod. Raymond thought as he panted heavily, unable to recall the last time every cell in his body had been strained to this extent. I really hope the pressure doesn't keep mounting like this. If it continues like this for even half a day more, I'll probably pass out from sheer fatigue. He prayed silently, unable to stop himself from cursing Soren's defensive fighting style, as he desperately wished for the battle to end as soon as possible so that he could finally be freed from these crushing constraints. Meanwhile, the invited special guests and dignitaries. It was only after the second ring collapsed that the invited special guests and dignitaries truly began to feel uneasy. Since most of them had been offered seating between the third and fourth rings of the Chakravya, a quiet panic started spreading through the crowd, as the realization set in that if the third ring were to fall, they would be the next ones standing in the cult army's path. Surely the cult army won't be able to reach us, right? Surely as special guests will be kept safe no matter what, right? One of them asked, his voice betraying his nerves, as those around him responded with uneasy looks rather than reassurance. Why yeah, I'm sure it won't even come to that. I mean, just look at the cult army right now, they can't push through the third ring at all. The third ring is made up of some of the most elite soldiers of the righteous faction. They won't be easy to break through. Another guest said, trying to sound confident, as the surrounding dignitaries began nervously cheering for the third ring's defenders, watching as transcendent tier warriors unleashed one devastating AoE technique after another, wiping out hundreds of cult soldiers at a time while holding their ground with brutal efficiency. As for now, it seemed like they were going to be okay. Meanwhile, within the cult medical ship, more mana stones. We need more high purity mana stones. Assistance. Why is there a delay? Fetch me my stones, now. The chief medical officer shouted in rage, as the assistants around him trembled with fear. So far, Leo's body had already absorbed over 4,000 high-purity mana stones, which was enough to fuel a large-sized destroyer ship for a year, and it seemed like his body still needed more. Chief, we have already brought you all the excess stones that we brought with us to this mission. If you still need more, we might have to pull some out of the ship's core. A brave assistant said, as the chief shot him an angry glance. Do you not understand the meaning of now? The ship's fuel is not important. The Lord regaining consciousness is the priority. Go fetch me those stones at once. The chief screamed, as the assistants scrambled at once, their footsteps hurried as they returned within a couple minutes with a bag full of stones. Healer Darren, what more do you think we need to do? The chief asked his colleague, as Darren stroked his chin thoughtfully. Before shaking his head non-committally. We have already done everything we could. We have fixed all the micro-tears in his muscles and limbs. We have removed all lingering traces of the chaotic energy moving through his circuits. And we have now refilled his depleted mana reserves with fresh mana. There's not much more we can do. According to my estimates, the Lord should have woken up by now. Darren said, as his reply made the chief's heart fall in his chest. They had indeed done everything by the book, and had fixed Leo's body to the best of their abilities, and yet, Leo still lay in slumber, in a phenomenon that they could not fully understand. Do we want to try something drastic like pouring water over his face? Or shocking him with electric discharge? Or will that be overstepping our bounds? The chief asked, as Darren shot him a desperate glance. Our men need the Lord. I'm sure, even if we take a drastic measure. Just this once, it will be okay. Darren encouraged, as under his guidance, the chief prepared a mild electric charge before connecting the ends to Leo's fingertips. Ready for shock, in 3, 2. The chief began counting, however, before he could complete the countdown, Leo's eyes flung open off his own volition, as the cult's shadow dragon finally regained consciousness. Chapter 935 I Have a Lord Father. Within the cult medical ship, the pit, Leo's POV. Leo jolted awake. His eyes snapped open first, sharp and alert, as his awareness surged outward instinctively, scanning for restraints, hostile presences, mana suppression fields, or any other forms of immediate danger. However, there were none. No chains bound his limbs, and no killing intent was directed his way, as the only thing amiss that he found with his body were the small electric shock wires wrapped around his fingers. Pluck. Throw. Throwing those shock wires away, he drew in a slow breath before clenching and unclenching his fingers into a fist, as he confirmed that this was the real world and no longer a dreamscape. Lord, you're awake. The chief medical officer's voice broke through his focus, sharp with disbelief and relief in equal measure, as Leo turned his head slightly to regard the man without speaking, his expression calm, composed, and already moving past the moment. How long was I out for? Leo asked. Give me the exact time. The chief stiffened at once, instinctively straightening as he glanced down at the chronometer strapped to his wrist, eyes flicking rapidly as he performed some quick mental calculations. 5 hours and 43 minutes, my lord. He answered, as Leo gave him a short nod of acknowledgement. Jump. Jumping off the medical bed, Leo landed on the floor soundlessly, his body feeling well rested and ready for action, as he gave the doctors present in the room a grateful glance. Great job everyone, keep it up. He praised before walking out of the room, as he rushed straight for the ship's exit. Step. Step. While walking, he quickly began warming up his muscles and joints, as he rolled his shoulders, and extended his arm outward to slowly pop the joints and get rid of the lingering stiffness in his body. Crack. Pop. His hips followed, rotating in a controlled circle as he loosened the last traces of tightness left behind by forced recovery and prolonged unconsciousness, as he regained peak fitness. If I was out for 5 hours and 43 minutes, then according to the schedule, the army should be about halfway through the third ring by now. He thought, as a small frown formed on his face. According to his initial plan, he was meant to lead the cult army through the enemy lines. However, Multhorak's unfiltered aura had proven to be more than what he could handle, and hence he had no idea now as to how the battle was progressing at this moment. I hope they haven't fallen too far behind schedule. He prayed, as he stepped towards the exit of the medical ship. Hiss. The ramp of the medical ship hissed open as he approached, light spilling in from outside along with the distant roar of battle, as the sound of clashing forces rolled across the air in layered waves. Screams. Explosion. Metal ringing. Leo stepped out with a calm expression on his face, as he began assessing the cult army's current position. Not bad, he thought. As to his pleasant surprise, the cult army had managed to reach the third ring even without him, yet unfortunately, they seemed to be clustered along its outer edge, formations compressed, momentum stalled as transcendent tier pressure pressed down from ahead, the Chakravia holding firm despite the carnage already inflicted. Barely at the periphery, Leo assessed silently, eyes tracking the macro outlook of the war, as he let out a half-relieved sigh. Sorry for the delay lads, Multhorak's aura really did a number on me, he thought, as he cracked his neck and unsheathed his daggers. If he were a lesser man, he might have felt disappointed by the cult army currently being behind schedule. However, since he was not, he only felt clarity. Without me spearheading the advance, he thought, exhaling slowly. It's a miracle they've stayed this close to schedule at all. He concluded, before activating Enhance as he jumped. Crack. Boom. The ground beneath his feet cracked, and the air around him unleashed a sonic boom, as he broke through the sound barrier and launched his body skyward in a single explosive motion aimed straight for the front line of the battlefield. Meanwhile Dumpy, by pushing far beyond the role he was meant to play and plunging alone into a battlefield saturated with transcendent tier pressure, Dumpy had long since crossed the threshold where brute resilience alone was enough to carry him through untouched. At first, the blows he felt were inconsequential. Nothing more than glancing techniques that skidded off his hide or weapons that melted off before they could bite. But as the minutes stretched on and the transcendence adjusted, those glancing hits began landing with intent rather than desperation, layered attacks slipping through timed gaps, as coordinated pressure found purchase where chaos once reigned. Slash. A blade scraped along his flank. Shallow. But real. Boom. Another strike caught his shoulder, tearing through skin rather than bouncing away, green blood spilling freely as it ran down his massive arm and dripped into the ruined ground below. More followed. Small cuts. Hairline gashes. Impact bruises that throbbed beneath his skin. Individually meaningless, and yet, together accumulating, as Dumpy began to feel its effects. It stings, he thought, as he began to feel the slow erosion of his strength, his body being forced to endure beyond its designed limits, as he felt his breaths growing heavier and his movements to lose a fraction of their former explosiveness. How long can I endure this? He wondered, as the enemy noticed his slowdown as well. Men, be brave and continue attacking. A transcendent lieutenant roared from behind the lines, his voice amplified by mana and desperation alike. We can cut off the beast's limb soon at this rate. Another voice joined in, louder, sharper. He's just one beast. We are an army. If 100 hits are not enough, then we strike him 1,000 times. Their shouts fed into one another, courage manufactured through repetition as the righteous soldiers pressed harder, formations tightening as confidence crept back into their ranks. The cult army is finished the moment the big green beast falls. Take him down, and this war is ours. They believed it. They needed to believe it. As surrounded on all sides and battered by a storm of blades, techniques, and compressed force, Dumpy listened to their voices while standing knee-deep in corpses, his skin marked by cuts and blood, yet his posture still remaining unbowed, as despite their serious threats, he still smiled an unbothered smile. It was not a wide smile, nor a savage one. It was just proud beyond belief. As though, their words had no effect on his psyche whatsoever. You mongrels already had your chance to kill me, Dumpy began calmly, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the battlefield despite the chaos. And you failed. As things stand, I don't believe you can kill me anymore. He claimed boldly, as a relatively young righteous soldier stepped forward from the ranks, arrogance burning brighter than his caution as he leveled his weapon at Dumpy's chest. Oh yeah, the man sneered. And why is that, beast? Did you magically unlock immortality while we were busy cutting you down? He asked, as Dumpy's smile only widened in response. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted one sword and pointed toward the sky. Above the battlefield, where the air itself seemed to ripple. No, he said, pride thick in his voice. I did not unlock immortality. His eyes gleamed. But I did unlock a Lord Father. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Chapter 936 The Demon of Omega. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit. Leo descended from the sky like a falling judgment. His speed and trajectory compressed the air beneath him as he dropped, momentum folding the atmosphere tight against the battlefield below. As the impact collapsed inward first upon contact, stone buckling and folding beneath his boots before a delayed shockwave erupted outward, carving a shallow crater into the battlefield. Crash! The ground screamed. A ring of pulverized stone and shattered earth blasted outward as transcendent tier soldiers were torn from their footing and hurled away in every direction, bodies spinning helplessly through the air as formations that had held firm for hours were disrupted in an instant, their cohesion erased by the sheer force of his arrival. FSHHH. Plop. Dust surged upward. Debris rained down. And at the center of it all, Leo stood still. He did not immediately rush to press the advantage, as he instead straightened at an unhurried pace, rolling his shoulders once while the last fragments of stone slid from his boots, his daggers already resting in his hands as he swept a calm, assessing gaze across the battlefield to finalize his approach. There, he identified, before moving. Slash. Slash. The first couple strikes he made were rather simple, just two large-scale dagger arcs that tore outward with such force that they cut cleanly through the front ranks of enemy soldiers, as armor parted, bodies separated, and blood misted into the dust-filled air. Arg. Puhh. A few screams arose at first, but soon silence crept in. Not because the war had stopped, but because something far more oppressive had taken its place, as Leo gently lowered his weapons. Ha! He let out a half-chuckle, as he straightened his arms and raised his chin, his posture relaxed and unhurried, as though he needed to give no clarifications for arriving to the battle late. Kneel, he demanded, as although the word carried no emphasis, no anger, no threat, the moment it left his lips, the entire battlefield trembled. Tremble. Choke. A suffocating, crushing aura rolled across the battlefield in layered waves, pressing down on righteous soldiers' mind and body alike as despite them trying their best to stay upright, their knees began to wobble and their vision started to turn dizzy. Thousands of transcendent tier warriors stiffened, then trembled, their breathing growing more labored, their balance failing their senses, as across a full 2-kilometer span, tens of thousands of elite righteous soldiers felt their strength falter simultaneously, knees buckling under invisible weight as instincts screamed in warning, their bodies responding before pride or training could intervene, as by the thousands, they fell. Thud. Crash. Armor rang softly against stone as knees struck the ground, weapons slipping from numb fingers as soldiers who moments earlier had stood unyielding now found themselves unable to remain upright, their will crushed beneath an overwhelming presence they could neither resist nor comprehend. The whole outlook of the battlefield changed. Not through blood, but through dominance. As Leo arriving alone resolved the stalemate that had gripped the war. For many minutes before his arrival. It's the Lord. Lord Shadow Dragon is here. Look guys. The Lord has regained consciousness. He's here to lead us to victory. The cult soldiers said, as looking at Leo's back, they could not find it within themselves to feel fear anymore, as the exhaustion weighing down their bodies was abruptly drowned beneath a rising surge of certainty, as though something fundamental had been restored the moment he stepped onto the battlefield. Suppressed laughter. Muted cheers. Some laughed under their breath while others swallowed hard, as battered hands tightened around weapons that suddenly felt lighter, steadier, as hearts that had been pounding with strain now beat with purpose instead, adrenaline flooding veins that had been running dry only moments earlier. He's standing in front of us. He really came back. He didn't leave us behind. The words passed through the ranks in low, disbelieving murmurs, as no one dared raise their voice too loudly, as though speaking any stronger might shatter the moment, as though this presence was something fragile that had to be respected rather than celebrated. Leo did not turn. He did not acknowledge them. He did not even glance back. And yet, that refusal to address them only deepened the effect, as it made his stance feel absolute, unwavering, as though he had never doubted for a second that they would still be standing when he arrived, as though the outcome of this war had already been decided in his mind and everything unfolding now was merely the process of catching up to that conclusion. Behind him, cult soldiers straightened one by one, as hunched shoulders lifted and staggered footing stabilized, as those who had been dragging themselves forward moments earlier now planted their feet with intent, feeling alive in a way that went beyond physical recovery. They did not feel protected. They felt led. Not through words, and not through commands, but through the certainty that the man standing ahead of them would walk first into whatever awaited them next, as though death itself would have to reach past him to claim them. Conversely, the righteous faction soldiers felt none of that clarity. They whispered among themselves as dread crept through their formations, as eyes that had once been filled with disciplined resolve now flicked toward Leo again and again, unable to tear themselves away from the figure who had overturned the battlefield's balance. Simply by arriving. It's the demon of Omega. One voice stammered, barely audible beneath the chaos, as nearby soldiers stiffened at the name. Didn't he wipe out our armies on 2 planets by himself? Another whispered, disbelief and terror bleeding into one another, as memories resurfaced that had been buried beneath doctrine and denial. Why won't my legs move? A third voice cracked, panic spreading as soldiers realized their bodies were reacting before their minds could, instinct screaming warnings that training could not suppress. No commands came fast enough. No formation felt solid anymore. As Leo stood unmoving at the center of the storm he had created, the righteous soldiers understood something they had not prepared for. This war had just changed. And they were no longer certain they were on the side that could survive it. Chapter 937 Fear. Execution livestream continuation, across the universe. For a while, as the cult army stalled against the warriors of the Third Ring, the righteous faction's citizens began to believe once again that their army could win this war, because for the first time since the execution broadcast began, the terrifying momentum that had shaken entire star systems no longer felt unstoppable. Get in there. Don't let those monsters advance. This is it, we've got them in a chokehold. This is as far as they go. Cheers rose across planets, stations, and sanctuaries, echoing through public squares and private chambers alike, as citizens who had been watching in dread now leaned forward with renewed hope, fists clenched and voices raised, as the image of transcendent tier defenders holding firm fed into a collective belief that the worst might finally be over. Come on, brave soldiers. Crush the cult completely. Screens across the universe showed cult formations slowing, vanguard units being torn apart by wide-area techniques, bodies flung backward in violent arcs, as the righteous faction's elite finally appeared to assert dominance, their disciplined ranks in overwhelming force presenting an image of control that many had desperately needed to see. For a brief span of time, celebration felt justified. Relief spread. Fear loosened its grip. Some even allowed themselves to smile. However, that moment did not last. Because the battlefield changed all at once the instant Leo's skyshard descended into the war. Across countless worlds, the same reaction unfolded simultaneously, as voices cut off without finishing their words, breaths catching in throats, eyes widening in disbelief, as the live feed showed the sky above the battlefield distort and compress, followed by a single, impossible impact that silenced even the most fervent supporters. Crash! A massive crater formed, followed by a powerful shockwave that flung bodies aside like debris. And then the camera displayed his visage emerge through the dust, as he stood at the center of it all unbothered. For a heartbeat, no one dared to speak, the silence emerging naturally, as though something fundamental had pressed down on the collective consciousness of the righteous faction, making celebration feel inappropriate, as faint waves of dizziness rippled through the spectators. Stumble. Some stumbled back from displays. Others sat down without realizing they had moved. While a few reached for support rails or walls, brows furrowed as nausea and unease washed through them without explanation, as though their instincts were reacting to something their minds had not yet processed. "That's," one voice whispered on a crowded station concourse, trailing off without finishing the thought. "No, I thought he was dead at the start." Another muttered, eyes locked on the figure lowering his weapons with unsettling calm, as Leo looked directly into the live stream camera and muttered the words, "Kneel." The moment Leo spoke, the reaction turned from shock into something far worse, as across the universe, citizens watched tens of thousands of transcendent tier warriors drop to their knees in unison, elite soldiers who had been presented as unbreakable suddenly failing to remain upright, as Leo established his dominance through his aura alone. "It's him. It's the demon of Omega." Someone screamed in panic, as the cheers that had filled the air just moments earlier turned into panicked shouts. He didn't even attack them. He just stood there. Another noted, as the realization spread quickly amongst the onlookers, that with Leo's arrival, the war they thought they understood had been rendered obsolete. How is he so strong? Only demigods are supposed to perform such feats, and I'm positive that he can't be a demigod. An army monarch watching the stream said, as he could not believe. As to how someone at the monarch tier could display such a feat of strength. Just how many men has he killed for his killing intent to be so strong? To suppress thousands of transcendents at once, his overall kill count must be in the billions. What a fucking monster. Another old military commander noted, as those with knowledge about aura and true strength became baffled with what Leo currently displayed. The third ring is done for. If they can't stand up to his aura alone, then they won't be able to resist his attacks at all. A war tactician noted, as dread settled into the hearts of every soldier watching across the universe, as they all had the same exact thought run through their mind. "I am glad I wasn't invited to fight on the pit. Or else it would be my head that would be decapitated next." They thought, as the realization spread, that what they were witnessing was not merely the return of a powerful combatant to the forefront, but rather the arrival of an annihilator that was capable of overturning every assumption the righteous faction had so far relied upon. Across cities and orbital platforms, the execution broadcast was no longer watched with cheers or clenched fists, but with rigid stillness, as people remained rooted to their places, eyes fixed on the screens while an unspoken understanding settled into the collective mind of the righteous faction. This was not a battle-turning moment. This was a judgment being delivered. Families who had moments earlier spoken of victory fell silent, as parents instinctively pulled children closer, as though distance itself could offer protection from what was unfolding light years away, while military analysts and veterans stared in grim disbelief, recognizing the posture, the composure, the absolute lack of urgency that only appeared when the outcome was already decided. "He hasn't even started yet," someone whispered in a command chamber, voice hollow. "He's not fighting them," another replied, barely audible. "He's just measuring how long they can endure," he noted, as the feed continued to show transcendent tier soldiers kneeling, some trembling, others coughing blood, as the image burned itself into the public consciousness, fracturing long-held beliefs about divine order, righteous supremacy, and guaranteed victory. This was not how heroes were supposed to look. This was not how today's execution stream was supposed to go. And yet, because it was so unexpected, the impact it made was that much more significant, as fear of a cult-ruled universe returned into every heart, watching for the first time in over 2 millennia. No, this can't be. Those monsters can't be allowed to win. What is this? Did the cult secretly hack the livestream or what? Surely this can't be real. On countless worlds, citizens quietly began turning off their displays, unable to continue watching, while others remained frozen, compelled by the knowledge that history had just taken a decisive step onto a different path, one whose outcome could no longer be predicted with certainty. What's happening? Will evil triumph over good this time? Someone asked, as everyone shook their heads in dismay, unable to refute the man or his words this time. Chapter 938, A Disruptor of Destiny. Execution livestream continuation, Aegon Ver's POV. Ver watched everything unfolding around him with bated breath, his awareness stretched thin as he was forced to witness too many things at once. The clash between Soren and Helmuth raged close enough for him to feel every violent ripple of power, the two gods going at each other at speeds his mortal eyes could not even comprehend, while at the same time, he could also see the cult army advance toward him inch by inch, their formations tightening, thinning, reforming as they paid for every meter with blood. This is not good. The realization settled heavily in his chest as the battle dragged on, as the screams began to blur together and the number of fallen grew faster than his mind wanted to process. So many are dying for me. The thought did not come with pride. It came with guilt. With each passing minute, the weight of those losses pressed harder against his consciousness, until the cult finally reached the third circle and their advance ground to a halt, transcendent pressure slamming into them like an unyielding wall. Ver's jaw clenched as he watched cult soldiers fall by the thousands every passing second, their bodies torn apart under violent techniques meant to slay beasts and not humans. What are you doing, you stupid idiots? His hands trembled slightly. You don't need to sacrifice this many lives just to save one man. The thought burned. Turn away. Leave. Leave while you still can. He swallowed hard. It's enough for me to know that you came. The words echoed inside him as his gaze finally wavered, unable to endure the sight any longer, as he turned away from the battlefield with a sharp breath, his chest tight with helpless frustration and shame. And then, something shifted. The pressure changed. The air itself felt different. As the sound of the battlefield altered its rhythm. Murmurs. Scattered chatter. The deafening sound of clashing steel and detonating techniques began to fade, not because the war had ended, but because something far heavier had entered it, replacing chaos with a suffocating stillness that spread unnaturally fast. Confused, Ver turned back. His eyes widened. There, descending from the sky like an inevitable force, was a figure he knew better than anyone else. Leo. The name surfaced instinctively, barely formed, as his breath hitched. From this distance, he could only see his brother's silhouette, the way he stood unmoving at the center of the battlefield, the way tens of thousands bent before him without resistance, yet even from afar, the sight was unmistakable. Aegon Ver felt something inside his chest crack. A dam he had been holding back for far too long. His vision blurred slightly as a tear threatened to escape, his throat tightening as emotions he had buried beneath resolve and endurance surged forward all at once. Relief, fear, guilt, and above all, hope. You had warned me a million times to not roam the wider universe alone. You had begged me to join you inside the time-stilled world. And yet, me being the fool that I am, never heeded your advice. It's my fault that thousands are dying here each second, and still, even after everything I did wrong, you still came, cuz. Ver thought gratefully, as at this moment he could even begin to convey the feeling of gratitude that he felt towards Leo. As although he was an orphan who had no family, at this moment he realized what true blood bonds were supposed to be like. Meanwhile Morris. Ver was not the only one keeping a close watch on the developments unfolding both within and beyond the heart of the Chakravia, as the deceiver observed them just as intently. Tracking the cult army's movements with meticulous focus, the deceiver let out an unrestrained yelp of surprise and delight the moment Leo entered the fray. Shine. Gold threads. In that instant, a dozen luminous golden threads burst forth from Leo's body, stretching outward across the battlefield as they connected him to Morris, Caliph, Helmuth, and Soren alike. It was as though fate itself had tightened its grip, placing a mere mortal at the center of converging destinies, where the outcome of a single battle could decide the fates of cosmic beings. Interesting. How very, very interesting. Morris mused, as by now Leo Skyshard had carved a permanent impression into his mind, one that quietly elevated the mortal's status from a disposable variable to something far more valuable, far more dangerous, as the deceiver's pupils dilated with naked fascination while he leaned forward slightly, fingers twitching as though resisting the urge to reach out and touch the unfolding moment himself. Lick. Slowly, indulgently, Morris raised one hand and ran his tongue along his fingers, savoring the sensation as if the taste of destiny itself lingered there, his grin widening into something unhinged and unapologetic as laughter bubbled just beneath the surface of his breath. A mortal who bends the flow of destiny without realizing it, he murmured, voice low with delight. A blade sharp enough to cut into fate, yet unaware of whose throats it's brushing against. His gaze flicked toward the golden threads linking Leo to beings who had shaped ages with their whims, and the sight made his shoulders shake faintly with restrained mirth, as though the universe had just offered him a rare joke meant only for his eyes. How long has it been, Morris continued softly, since a single soul carried the potential to tip the scales so cleanly? He licked his fingers again, slower this time, savoring the anticipation rather than the act, as his thoughts spiraled outward, racing through branching possibilities that split and rejoined like fractured mirrors, each one reflecting a future soaked in either ruin or triumph. Chaos, he whispered, tasting the word. Glorious, inconvenient chaos. Would Leo shatter the battlefield and drag the gods into an outcome none of them had prepared for, or would he unknowingly open a door that allowed fortune to flow toward those clever enough to seize it? First, Morris wondered, as his smile sharpened at the thought that either result would be exquisite in its own way. Doom or fortune, he hummed, eyes gleaming. It hardly matters. Because for the first time in a very long while, the deceiver was not watching a rehearsed tragedy unfold. He was watching improvisation. And that, more than anything else, made him delighted to see what. Chapter 939 Momentum. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit, Leo's POV. Leo waited to see if there was anybody in the enemy camp that could still stand up against his aura and defy his will. However, after waiting for a full minute, when not a single enemy managed to remain upright, when not even one transcendent could force their shaking legs to respond or lift their head against the suffocating pressure crushing their minds and bodies, he became convinced that there was no one left who required special attention. All right, if there's no one special amongst you, then I guess it's time to start making up for lost time, he thought, as he lurched into motion at once. Storm Flash Traverse. Using Storm Flash Traverse, Leo ceased to exist at a single point, and instead became a chain of ruptures, space tearing and re-stitching itself as his body snapped from position to position in violent succession. Gahhh. Glug. The first transcendent died kneeling, a dagger punching up through the base of his jaw and exploding out the crown of his skull. Fragments of bone and gray matter spraying outward as the head was wrenched free, the body slumping forward while blood poured out in thick, pulsing streams that soaked into the dirt. However, before his head could even hit the ground, Leo was already elsewhere. Slash. A second soldier's chest collapsed inward as a blade drove straight through his ribcage and heart, the impact liquefying organs in an instant, ribs shattering outward as crimson mist burst from his mouth and nostrils, as the corpse folded around the weapon before sliding off and crumpling in a twitching heap. A third never finished lifting his head, as Leo appeared beside him and carved cleanly through the spine at the nape of the neck, the cut so precise that the body remained upright for a heartbeat longer before the nervous system failed, the head rolling away while the torso toppled sideways, limbs jerking uselessly in the mud, while Storm Flash carried Leo onward. Slash. Splat. Slash. Thud. Leo became destruction personified as with every passing second, he killed between 3 to 4 opponents, racking up an average kill count of 200 per minute, as he severed limbs, pierced eye sockets and snapped spines like brittle twigs. Plop. Splat. Crush. For the trillions watching across the universe, the scene was almost too gruesome to watch with a straight face, as Leo tore hearts free from bodies and crushed them in his grip, before flinging the remains aside as he moved on without pause. Within minutes, the ground quickly became slick, boots sinking into layers of gore as Leo advanced through the kneeling ranks, carving a widening corridor of ruin through the third ring, as every flash of his movement left behind another cluster of mutilated corpses. Help. Somebody please help. Commanders. Please leave the fourth ring and come save us. Commanders. The Transcendents cried, and yet, even they knew that nobody was going to come to their aid. Slaughtered them where they can, transforming what had once been a once unbreakable wall into a collapsing lane of carnage. Step, cheers, charge. Behind him, the cult army surged forward instinctively, pouring into the path he created as they finished off the stragglers that he missed and stabbed the ones that were already dead 100 more times just to make sure that not even their corpses remained recognizable. Fuck the righteous faction. Long live the cult of ascension. They shouted as they walked, as they followed Leo deeper and deeper into the third ring as if taking a casual stroll. Heaven-destroying spear. A sudden shout cut through the chaos from Leo's left, as Commander Anderson Silva finally stopped holding back, his spear blazing with compressed mana as he drove it forward in a sweeping arc that tore through the air like a screaming blade, the technique unfolding outward in a massive crescent as space buckled under the strain and hundreds of kneeling Transcendents were caught mid-collapse, their bodies torn apart as the spear light carved through ranks and detonated upon impact. Kaboom! The shockwave rippled outward in layered force, bodies flung aside as armor ruptured and limbs separated, the corridor Leo had carved widening further as Anderson stepped into the opening without hesitation, spear striking again and again as he advanced in sync with Leo's movement rather than trailing behind it. Watching Leo and Anderson tear through the third ring without slowing, something shifted inside the other commanders as well, as Mickey became the next to react. A sharp grin split his face as he cracked his neck and brought his palms together, mana coiling violently between them before he tore his hands apart, reality fracturing at the seams as spatial pressure exploded outward in synchronized bursts. Rift Bloom Barrage. Dozens of ruptures bloomed across the battlefield in rapid succession, each one collapsing inward with crushing force as kneeling Transcendents were caught inside distorted space, their bodies folding unnaturally as bones snapped and organs burst under invisible pressure, the ground beneath them sinking and cracking as the detonations overlapped. Mickey moved with the chaos rather than away from it, weaving forward as his techniques detonated around him, widening the lane of slaughter while maintaining the tempo Leo had set, his attacks timed to strike clusters Leo had already destabilized, ensuring nothing ahead of them remained standing. To Leo's right, Darnell Nuna let out a sharp exhale as he finally stepped fully into the advance, his aura surging outward as he lifted his weapon and brought it down in a brutal descending arc, the slash expanding as it traveled and tearing through multiple rows of Transcendents at once, bodies breaking apart as the force plowed forward and smashed into the battlefield ahead. However, Darnell did not stop at one strike. He continued pressing forward, unleashing one devastating technique after another as he forced the third ring to collapse inward under relentless pressure, his movements heavy and decisive as he carved a straight path that ran parallel to Leo's, ensuring the army behind them had nothing left to slow its advance. And then, the ground trembled violently. A massive shadow surged forward through the chaos as Dumpy finally closed the distance, his battered body still bleeding from dozens of cuts yet his posture unbroken as he slammed into the vanguard like a living siege engine, twin swords rising and falling in brutal arcs while acid sprayed outward in wide sweeps that melted armor and flesh alike. Arghhh. Slash. Crush. Transcendents caught in his path were crushed under sheer mass and force, their bodies mangled as Dumpy roared and advanced alongside the others, refusing to fall behind now that Leo had returned to the front. Together, the five of them moved as a single spearhead. Leo at the center, blurring forward with Storm Flash traverse as heads fell and bodies collapsed in his wake. Anderson tearing open massive corridors with spear light. Mickey clearing the stragglers. Darnell smashing resistance through overwhelming force. And Dumpy anchoring the advance through raw devastation. As behind them, the cult army surged forward at breakneck pace, pouring into the widening path of ruin as the third ring finally began to collapse in earnest, its once impenetrable structure unraveling under coordinated annihilation, as the cult regained the momentum that they had lost and began making up for lost time very quickly. Chapter 940 The True Situation. Meanwhile, within a Su family flagship, Su Tang's POV. Su Tang felt genuinely surprised to see the cult army still thriving so many hours into the war, as the livestream continued to show their forces not merely enduring but advancing with stubborn persistence, a development that quietly exceeded even his most generous expectations. This is interesting, he mused, as from the very beginning the Su clan had never wished for the cult's failure, yet had always doubted their competence, knowing full well that the Chakravya was not something conviction alone could overcome, which was why they had assumed the cult would at best sow chaos before being crushed, buying just enough time for the Su family to complete their planetary raids without interference. And yet, here they were. Most of the planned raids had already been completed with efficiency, resources secured and resistance neutralized ahead of schedule, while the cult army continued to advance rather than collapse, pushing deeper into territory they had never been expected to reach. "This is almost inspirational," Su Tang said, as his gaze remained fixed on the massive projection before him, a faint curve forming at the corner of his lips while battlefield telemetry updated in real time. Beside him, Su Yong folded his arms as he studied the same feed with a fascinated interest, his expression clearly proud as he saw Leo make thousands of transcendents kneel all at once. "What do we do now, father?" Su Yong asked, as his eyes flicked briefly toward Su Tang before returning to the livestream. "We've already completed all the raids we planned for this window. Do we now capitalize on the extra time and hit additional planets, or do we head back home for now?" he asked, as under normal circumstances, it would have been a sensible suggestion to continue raiding, and yet Su Tang shook his head in rejection. "No," the Su clan patriarch said firmly, as he began to stroke his chin. "The war has reached a critical point now, and continuing raids at this moment would be short-sighted." Su Tang replied, as he shifted his glance from the livestream projection towards Su Yong. "Don't be alarmed, son. You don't fully understand the Chakravua's internal mechanics yet, so it's natural you don't see what I see." Su Tang continued, his voice sounding calm and unhurried. "But since I understand exactly what's going on over there, let me just say, it's quite fascinating," he explained, as Su Yong blinked in confusion. "I don't yet understand why Soren hasn't been executed, nor do I fully grasp how the cult army is progressing this quickly through the Chakravya rings. However, what I do understand is that the righteous faction is under far more strain than the livestream makes it appear," he commented, as it was at this point that Su Yong decided to interrupt. "What do you mean?" Su Yong asked, as his brow furrowed slightly while he leaned forward. "Let me give you some context, son, so you can see it too. You see, each ring of the Chakravya is sustained by a specific tier of warriors," Su Tang explained, as his gaze never left the battlefield. "Masters and grandmasters on the outer layers. Transcendents further in. Monarchs anchoring the fourth ring. And gods and demigods at the core. Right now, with the cult attacking the third ring, what most onlookers believe is that even if they somehow get through the third ring, there's no way they get through the fourth as well, since a ring full of monarchs is exponentially harder to breach compared to a ring made up of transcendents. However, that's not entirely true. You see, the way the Chakravya works is that, with every ring that collapses, the burden required to maintain the formation doesn't vanish. It radiates inward." His fingers paused briefly against his chin. "At present, the gods and demigods making up the innermost core are absorbing most of that strain, which is why the mortals further out can still function normally. But if the third ring collapses, then the burden would become too great for even the gods to bear for extended amounts of time, which means that they must share it outwards. And the only ones left to share it with," Su Tang continued, as he let the sentence hang deliberately. "The monarchs," Su Yong said, as realization finally dawned in his eyes. "Exactly," Su Tang replied, as he gave a slow nod. "That is why this war has just become interesting. Until now, I believed the cult could only disrupt the board. But I did not think they could really play on it. However, from this position, as things stand now, I do believe that they have at least a 5% chance of winning, which is pretty decent all things considered," Su Tang concluded, as Su Yong gasped in understanding. "So you think, maybe, just maybe, this war might prove to be the end of the righteous faction?" he asked, as Su Tang looked hopefully towards the livestream and nodded. "Could very well be. And just on the off chance it is, I really don't wish to miss seeing it live. Which is why I say that the raids can wait. We have already achieved everything that we needed to achieve to ensure the survival of the Su clan. From here onwards, let's just sit back and enjoy the show, just on the off chance that the underdog does end up winning this fight," Su Tang said, as Su Yong turned back toward the projection as well, his earlier detachment gone, as he now watched the livestream like it were a once-in-a-millennia historic event. Come on Leo, get the job done. Fucking put an end to the righteous faction for good. Su Yong rooted on, as he silently prayed that his friend could keep pushing forward without faltering, long enough to turn this improbable momentum into something irreversible before the universe found a way to correct it again. Chapter 941 Desperation. Execution livestream continuation, The Pit. As the cult army continued carving forward through the third ring with terrifying efficiency, cutting down transcendent tier defenders at a pace that shattered every prior expectation, it was not the soldiers locked in combat who reacted first to the shift in momentum, but rather the righteous faction's most distinguished guests and dignitaries seated behind them that did. Positioned between the third and fourth rings, their initial unease surfaced subtly, expressed through restless movement and quiet, sidelong glances toward the battlefield, as those who had arrived confident in their immunity began recalculating distances and probabilities in their minds, measuring the steadily shrinking space between themselves and the advancing carnage while watching the third ring's formation buckle in places it had never been designed to fail. This looks concerning. Will we be okay? Holy hell, I felt that clash here in my bones. The guests talked amongst one another, as they watched the third rings fall with wide eyes full of terror. Slip. Step. One by one, the wise ones who had already calculated the future, began to abandon their seating positions and retreat, as slowly but surely, unease began to spread through the civilian ranks in uneven waves. As conversations grew strained, voices rose in pitch, and bodies started drifting backward on instinct, as though distance alone might buy them safety. What began as cautious repositioning soon slid into open retreat, as clusters of civilians turned away from the battlefield and pressed deeper toward the fourth ring, their movement coalescing into a chaotic tide surging rearward in desperate unison, as fear overwhelmed decorum and self-preservation eclipsed what little dignity remained. Fuck this shit, I'm outta here. Excuse me gentlemen, I was wondering if you know the emergency evacuation route out of here. My lungs. Oh by Lord my lungs. I haven't run like this since I was 5. The dignitaries complained as they moved, only to be abruptly stopped when their chests were blocked by the wall that was the fourth ring. Block. No matter how hard they tried, or how charmingly they tried to slip through monarchs holding shields, not a single civilian was allowed through, as they were all forced to halt at the edge. Commander, please, let me pass, one man shouted, his voice cracking with desperation as he stepped forward from the crowd, hands raised in supplication as he gestured frantically toward the space beyond the fourth ring. Commander, I'll pay you any sum you wish, any amount at all, just let me stand beyond the fourth ring, just for a little while. He said, as his eyes darted back toward the battlefield repeatedly, as though expecting the cult army to burst through the third ring at any second. However, the monarch tier commander he addressed did not react at all, his stance remaining unchanged. Commanders, please let us through, another voice called out, louder and tinged with panic as a group of dignitaries pushed forward. Together, we are the distinguished guests invited by the universal government to witness this historic execution. We are the economic, scientific, and technological minds of the righteous faction. Surely you cannot expect us to stand here and face those evil cult bastards on our own. She said, as her voice trembled despite her attempt at authority, as her finely tailored robes brushed uselessly against the immovable wall of armored monarchs. As once again, the commanders did not move. Commanders, they are almost through the third ring, a third civilian shouted, sweat pouring down his face as he gestured wildly toward the battlefield. If you don't let us through now, we might not make it to safety in time. He pleaded, as bodies pressed closer from behind him and the crowd compressed under shared terror, the realization settling into every mind at once that escape was no longer guaranteed, no matter how loudly they begged or how far they tried to retreat. Yet despite the rising anxiety and the mounting desperation rippling through the civilians, the fourth ring remained utterly unmoved, its monarch tier defenders standing in perfect formation without so much as shifting their footing, their silence and stillness acting as an unspoken refusal more absolute than any shouted command. Nervous chatter. Growing anxiety. It was precisely this unyielding lack of response that finally broke something in the crowd, as fear curdled into panic and panic into frantic self-preservation, prompting some to shout their names, their titles, and their lifelong achievements, as they clung onto their status and reputation as if credentials might somehow outweigh orders forged by military doctrine and divine command. I am Director Halvin of the Universal Trade Consortium, one man yelled, his voice shrill with desperation as he thrust his identification forward, hands shaking violently. I have personally stabilized the economies of 12 core worlds, you cannot abandon me here. He shouted, as his words struck unmoving armor and fell away without effect, swallowed by the silence of the fourth ring. I am Professor Leora Vance, head of Righteous Faction Research Facility on Hedembrow, another cried out, her composure shattering as she gestured emphatically, without me, entire technological divisions will collapse, you owe me protection. She said, as her voice cracked under the weight of her own fear. Still, the fourth ring did not yield. As no matter the title or contribution, no one was allowed through. I apologize, Professor. A fourth ring commander eventually said, as he decided to speak on behalf of all other soldiers. It is not that the Righteous Faction Army does not wish to protect you all, or that I have any personal vendetta against you. If I could, I would let all of you civilians be behind me rather than in front, however, my orders here are strict and absolute. He continued, as his eyes did not soften even slightly. Beyond the fourth ring lies the core of the Chakravya, manned by gods and demigods, he said, as the weight of his words pressed down harder than any visible aura, and no one is permitted to approach it. He paused briefly. No one at all, whether ally or enemy. He finished, as his tone remained unchanged through to the end. Murmurs. Nervous chatter. For a while, the distinguished guests all looked at one another in confusion, as though waiting for someone else to speak up and diffuse this tense situation. However, as minutes passed and nobody did anything, the color started to drain from the guests' faces in unison, hope collapsing almost audibly as those present finally understood that their status, wealth, and influence meant nothing here. Some screamed. Others sobbed. A few, driven beyond reason, surged forward in a final attempt at survival, pushing their bodies uselessly against monarch tier shields that did not so much as tremble, their hands slipping against reinforced armor as though trying to shove a mountain aside. I built half the infrastructure you rely on, one man shouted, his voice cracking as he pressed forward, desperation bleeding into every word. You cannot let me die like this, he cried, as his plea dissolved into the surrounding chaos, swallowed by shoving bodies and overlapping screams, yet none of it mattered, because the monarchs did not budge even an inch, their formation remaining absolute and unmoved, as trillions across the universe watched the scene unfold live, witnessing for the first time the unfiltered reality behind the righteous faction they had revered for generations. Chapter 942 Unraveling. Execution Livestream Continuation, Across the Universe. Across the righteous faction's countless worlds, stations, and orbital habitats, the mood shifted in a way no analyst had predicted, as the execution livestream stopped feeling distant and symbolic to the commoners and instead became uncomfortably personal. At first, many citizens watched the scene at the fourth ring with confusion rather than fear, brows furrowed as they tried to understand why the dignitaries were being held back, as surely there had to be a reason, some unseen protocol, some higher logic that justified what they were seeing. They're military men, someone muttered in a crowded habitation dome, as he crossed his arms defensively while keeping his eyes glued to the screen. They're just following orders. They probably don't have a choice here. A few nodded at that, grateful for an explanation that allowed the universe to remain orderly. But the longer the cameras lingered on the panicking guests, the stronger the discomfort became. Wait, isn't that Darren Fletcher? A woman suddenly asked, leaning closer to the display as the image zoomed in on a man screaming and pounding uselessly against monarchs holding shields. The famous adventurer. The one who cleared the Acme ruins by himself. Her voice wavered slightly. He saved 3 frontier colonies during the Rift Surge, another person added quietly, recognition dawning in his eyes as discomfort crept into his tone. They gave him a Medal of Valor on this very channel. On another world, in a bustling market square, a hush spread as a familiar face appeared on the broadcast, her finely tailored robes now disheveled as she begged for passage. Isn't that Professor Leora Vance? A young man whispered, as he instinctively lowered his voice. The scientist who developed the atmospheric stabilizers. My homeworld uses her tech. She's practically a national treasure, someone else said, swallowing hard. Why isn't anyone helping her? The justifications began to fracture. Some still tried to defend the monarchs, voices tight with forced logic, insisting that the fourth ring had to remain sealed, that protecting the gods and demigods took priority, that sacrifices were inevitable in war. That's how formations work, a commentator argued on a local network panel, as he wiped sweat from his brow. If the core falls, Soren escapes and the evil cult continues their reign of terror. This is necessary. Yet even as the words left their mouths, doubt crept in. Because the people on the screen were no longer faceless elites or abstract titles. They had names, histories, faces that citizens across the universe recognized. And with that realization, a deeply disturbing question began to take root in the minds of tens of billions, that if people this important were being left to fend for themselves by the righteous faction, then what chance would commoners like themselves ever have of being protected when the times truly grew difficult? In apartments, families fell silent as parents felt a rising discomfort grow within their chests. If they won't save them, a man murmured softly, his voice trailing off as he stared at the screen. Why would they ever bother with trying to save us? No one answered him. On public transports, conversations died mid-sentence as commuters stood frozen, watching civilians scream, plead, and finally collapse in despair as monarchs stood unmoving before them, their formation absolute and uncaring. This was not the righteous image people had grown up believing in. This was not the promise of protection they had been taught to trust. As the livestream continued, the discomfort grew heavier, pressing down on viewers everywhere, as the question surfaced again and again in different words but with the same meaning. When the time comes, who is worth saving, and who will be told to stand still and accept their fate? By the time the feed cut away, many citizens did not cheer, did not argue, and did not speak at all. They simply turned off their screens in silence, unsettled by the thought that the war had already reached them, not through invasion or destruction, but through doubt that could no longer be pushed aside. Man, this is some bullshit. Why won't they fucking move? A man finally exploded in a crowded residential atrium, his voice raw, as he slammed his fist against the railing beneath the screen. They're standing there like statues while people are begging in front of them. What kind of sick joke is this? He shouted, as several others snapped out of their stunned silence at once, anger spreading faster than fear ever had. Those aren't nobodies. Another voice cut in furiously. That's Darren Fletcher on the screen. Darren fucking Fletcher. If he gets told to kneel and wait for death, what exactly are the rest of us supposed to expect? She said, as her hands shook while she pointed at the display, the image of monarchs standing unmoved burning itself into her mind. This is exactly why the cult calls them liars, a man muttered nearby, the words slipping out low and venomous before he could stop himself. All that talk about justice and protection, and the moment it's inconvenient, they refuse to move a muscle. He said, as heads slowly turned toward him, not in outrage, but in grim recognition. Don't you dare defend them now, someone snapped when another tried to speak up. Don't you fucking dare say, orders, again. A real man would protect the weak. Hiding behind orders is a sign of weakness. Across plazas and transit hubs, voices rose in overlapping bursts, outrage finally finding release as citizens stopped whispering and started shouting, the livestream acting less like a broadcast and more like an accusation being hurled directly at them. So tell me, a woman demanded aloud, her voice sharp and shaking, when things go bad here, when it's our turn to panic, do we get a shield, or do we get told to stand still too? She asked, as no one answered her. Because no one could. The realization spread fast and ugly, not as fear anymore, but as anger. Sharpened into something dangerous, as people began to wonder whether or not the universal government was actually working for their safety and betterment or not. As by the time the feed shifted away, the damage became irreversible. As although the righteous faction had not lost territory in that moment, what they did lose was something much more important, as they started to lose the benefit of the doubt amongst the commoners, as generations of propaganda began to unravel in real time. Chapter 943 Through to the Fourth Ring. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit. Under Leo's leadership, the cult army managed to cut through 90% of the third ring in less than 40 minutes, as they rapidly advanced through the battlefield, making up for a lot of lost time. From above, the progression looked almost unreal, the cult's formation carving forward like a blade dragged through flesh, as gaps widened faster than the righteous lieutenants could plug them, while on the ground, the pressure felt constant and inescapable, the battlefield itself seeming to compress inward toward Leo's position. It was at this point that the dignitaries seated between the third and fourth rings finally crossed an invisible threshold, for Leo's aura finally reached them fully. Tremble, choke, wobble. There was no dramatic announcement, nor any sudden surge of mana meant to draw attention, as Leo's pressure had already been present in the air for some time, but it was the increased proximity of it that changed its nature entirely, transforming it from an oppressive weight into something lethal. Pant, gasp. At first, their breathing grew uneven. Men and women who had spent their lives insulated from danger found themselves gasping shallowly, chests refusing to expand properly as if the air itself had thickened, while hearts began to hammer erratically under strain they were never meant to endure. Knees buckled without warning. One dignitary stumbled forward, palms slapping uselessly against the ground as his legs refused to support him, confusion flashing across his face as he tried to push himself back up, only for his arms to tremble violently beneath his own weight. Blood followed soon after. Thin streams ran from nostrils, dripping onto dirty soil and expensive boots, as capillaries burst under internal pressure, while some clutched at their ears or temples, teeth chattering uncontrollably as migraines flared into blinding agony. This isn't right," a woman whispered, her voice barely audible as she pressed a trembling hand against her chest, fingers coming away slick with blood as she began coughing violently, each convulsion sending sharp pain through her ribs while crimson flecked her lips. Internal damage mounted silently. Organs bruised. Vessels ruptured. Hearts strained against invisible constraints that tightened with every passing second, as Leo continued advancing steadily, his presence unwavering, his aura unrelenting, as it remained indifferent to who stood in its path so long as they were not meant to stand at all. Some collapsed unconscious where they stood, bodies going limp as nervous systems shut down under overload, while others remained horrifyingly aware, eyes wide with dawning terror as their bodies betrayed them piece by piece. A man convulsed violently, foam and blood spilling from his mouth as his spine arched off the ground, muscles seizing until the movement stilled abruptly, leaving him staring sightlessly at the sky. Another clawed weakly at the air, fingers twitching as though trying to grasp something that might pull him free, before his arm fell slack and his head lolled sideways, breath rattling out one final time. All of it unfolded within meters of the fourth ring. And yet, the heartless monarch tier defenders did not move. They did not step forward to shield the collapsing civilians, did not glance down when bodies struck the ground at their feet, and did not flinch as blood pooled across the stone between their boots, their formation remaining perfectly intact as though the dying were no more than debris blown into their path. The cult army is almost through the third ring, all commanders brace for war. One of them heartlessly said, as instead of looking at the dying civilians, they kept their focus locked solely on the conflict, as if they had already classified the suffering individuals as nothing more than collateral. Please. One dignitary still conscious despite the blood pouring from his nose and ears said, as he crawled weakly toward the monarch line, dragging himself forward inch by agonizing inch, nails scraping uselessly against the ground as he lifted his head just enough to look up at the towering figures before him. "Please sir," he croaked, voice shredded as his lungs failed him. I can't breathe." His hand brushed against the faint shimmer of a monarch's shield, fingers slipping off as though touching glass, before his arm collapsed beneath him and his face struck the ground with a dull, final sound. Thud. And still, no one spared him a glance. 10 minutes later, as the cult finally cut through the third ring in its entirety, it was the monarchs who braced for war next, as the last transcendent formations collapsed behind Leo and the cult army surged forward into the space that had been denied to them for so long. The fourth ring did not break formation. Instead, its defenders adjusted. Without ceremony or shouted orders, monarch tier warriors shifted their footing in near-perfect unison, shields angling forward, weapons lowering into ready positions as layered auras rose and interlocked, reinforcing one another into a dense wall of power meant to halt momentum at any cost. Their attention did not linger on the bodies strewn at their feet, nor on the blood slicking the ground behind them, as their only concern now lay ahead, fixed squarely on the advancing cult army and the figure at its center who had rendered every previous calculation obsolete. "This is where it ends," one monarch muttered quietly, as his grip tightened around his weapon and mana surged through his limbs, reinforcing bone and muscle for the impact to come. For them, another replied, as his gaze tracked Leo's steady advance, measuring distance, timing, angles, already planning countermeasures while suppressing the unease clawing at the back of his mind. They knew what failure meant here. If the fourth ring broke, then nothing stood between the cult and the core of the Chakravya, nothing left to buffer the gods and demigods from the accumulated strain of the formation's collapse, which was why hesitation was no longer an option and retreat had been erased from consideration entirely. Orders flowed silently through the monarch line via trained signals and shared battlefield awareness, positioning specialists at key points, assigning kill zones, preparing layered techniques designed to overwhelm even an advancing army, as they committed fully to the only outcome they were permitted to pursue: stopping the cult at any cost. Chapter 944. Sorry for the inconvenience. Meanwhile, in the innermost ring of the Chakravya, Raymond's POV. Raymond could not help but curse the cult army and 7 generations of their ancestors. For the moment the cult army cut through the third ring, the pressure bearing down on him surged inward with brutal intensity, multiplying in a single instant as the formation rebalanced without mercy. For a brief moment, his vision vanished completely. The world slipped away as though it had been torn out from behind his eyes, leaving in its stead only a blinding emptiness that made his stomach lurch and his soul scream beneath a weight that was far beyond what his flesh or will had ever been forced to endure before this moment. "Oh fuck," Raymond muttered, the words escaping instinctively as his consciousness struggled to steady itself. When his sight returned, it did so unevenly, the surroundings snapping back into place in broken fragments as his knees wobbled dangerously beneath him, feet trembling as though they no longer belonged to him, while his arms shook at his sides despite every effort to hold them still. Thrum. The core of the Chakravya strained violently, as even without sound, Raymond felt it clearly, a deep spiritual groan rippling through the formation as its divine geometry warped under the sudden loss of an entire ring, causing its burden to be redistributed inward with crushing force. Gasp. Raymond sucked in a sharp breath, his chest burning violently as he forced his focus outward and tried to assess whether everyone was suffering just like him, or was it him alone that was hit the worst? How are the others holding? He wondered, as Clarence was the first to catch his eye. Rattle. Wobble. The demigod's teeth were clenched so tightly that blood seeped from the corner of his mouth, his jaw trembling as his entire frame quivered under the strain, hands curled into fists so rigid that veins bulged along his forearms, his body fighting desperately to remain upright. Clarence's eyes were wide with raw strain, the last traces of confidence stripped away from his face as each breath that he took now came shallow and forced, shoulders hitching faintly as though even inhaling demanded conscious effort. Gulp. Raymond swallowed hard as he shifted his gaze toward Terence next, who unsurprisingly looked no better than the two of them. With his eyes squeezed shut and his brow deeply furrowed, Terence stood with a pained expression carved into his face, as sweat streamed down his cheeks, and color drained from his knuckles. Miraculously, it seemed like his posture remained upright through sheer will alone, yet as seconds passed, even that resolve seemed to start to fray, his shoulders sagging fractionally with every passing second as he edged closer and closer to a full collapse. I can't do this for too long," he declared, as it became clear to Raymond that the load they were currently enduring had already exceeded what most demigods were ever meant to bear, and hence it came as no surprise that all of them hovered on the brink of failure. However, while the demigods struggled desperately, the gods alongside them fared little better, as the strain finally began to surface in subtle but undeniable ways. Deep frowns settled across their expressions, brows drawn tight as sweat pooled beneath their hairlines and slid slowly down temples that had not known exertion in centuries, their auras compressed inward and held taut, stretched across an invisible threshold that felt perilously close to snapping. Pant. Heavy exhale. Their breathing had grown heavier now, their panting loud and audible, as many even started to grit their teeth to remain standing firm. The collapse of the third ring had changed everything. The pressure that had once been diffused across layers of mortals and transcendents now slammed directly into the core, stacking inward relentlessly as the Chakravya demanded compensation for what had been lost. Raymond felt it in his soul. The extreme load of trying to hold up a formation that cut off the fourth dimension from the third. However, the longer he tried to hold on to it, the more it seemed to rebel now, as though something unseen pressed down upon his very existence, threatening to grind him apart if he faltered for even a moment. "I can't hold on to this much longer either," Raymond said at last, his voice strained despite his effort to keep it steady, legs shaking harder as he subtly adjusted his stance to avoid collapsing outright. I request permission to redirect part of the pressure outward toward the fourth ring, he said, as absolute silence followed. The great clan gods exchanged uneasy glances, tension tightening the space between them as calculation and reluctance warred behind their eyes, each of them understanding precisely what that request entailed. Redirecting the pressure would buy those manning the core some breathing room, however, it would also place a catastrophic burden upon the monarchs holding the fourth ring. Huff. Clarence let out a ragged breath beside Raymond, his shoulders hitching as he fought to remain conscious, while Terrence's breathing grew harsher, the strain pushing him ever closer to his limits. They were running out of time. And noticing this, it was Mu Shen that finally spoke. Do it, he said calmly, his voice steady as his eyes remained fixed forward, his hands unmoving despite the sweat soaking his palms. As the second he said those words, Raymond did not hesitate any longer. Push. Closing his eyes briefly, he braced himself and began rerouting the crushing pressure outward, fully aware that whatever awaited the fourth ring next would be beyond what any mortal force was ever meant to endure. Apologies for this inconvenience, lads. But it's about time you start to pull your weight around here, he thought, as a part of the crushing weight finally lifted from his soul, allowing him to draw a full breath again, as the unbearable pressure receded just enough to remind him what relief felt like, however fleeting and fragile it might be. Chapter 945 Beware. Meanwhile, inside the heart of the Chakravya, Helmuth's POV. No, 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 no. This is not over. Stop defending like a coward and come fight me like a man. No. Helmuth burst out in anger, as his voice tore through the heart of the formation and rebounded uselessly off divine barriers that no longer cared for his frustration, his aura flaring violently as his grip tightened around his weapon, knuckles whitening while the moment he had been promised slipped further and further out of reach. He could feel it. The deadline had passed. The narrow window they had all agreed upon, the one chance where Soren would face him alone, without interference, without layered pressure or divided focus, had closed while he was still forcing his way forward strike by strike. Soren would have been dead by now if he was not so stubbornly committed to defending instead of fighting properly. This is not how a true warrior is meant to fight, he thought, as his breathing grew uneven and the heat of his rage sharpened into something more desperate, his gaze snapping toward the others almost against his will. Morris stood nearby, posture relaxed in a way that only deepened Helmuth's irritation, fingers lazily flexing as though this entire ordeal was nothing more than entertainment, his eyes reflecting amusement rather than urgency as the wider battlefield pressed ever closer to their position. While Caliph, on the other hand, did not look amused at all. He looked resolved. Helmuth turned fully toward them then, anger bleeding into something dangerously close to pleading as his jaw tightened, as though refusing to accept what the situation demanded even while understanding it perfectly. Just a little more time. That was all he needed. One clean exchange. One opening. One moment where Soren could no longer retreat behind patience and endurance. But neither of them moved to accommodate him. You had your shot, Helmuth, Caliph said, his voice calm and unyielding as it cut cleanly through the noise of Helmuth's frustration. But the cult army is through the third ring, and we don't have time to dally around anymore. It's time to end this fight for once and for all. As he spoke, Caliph reached behind himself and drew the twin origin metal daggers free, their surfaces catching the glow of the sun high above as he rolled them once in his palms, before stepping to the side, as he began to circle Soren deliberately, his movements measured and predatory as he claimed a separate flank. Crunch. Helmuth's teeth ground together audibly. I'm sorry, old friend, Morris added, his tone almost regretful as he finally straightened, eyes flicking briefly toward Helmuth before returning to Soren. But I am forced to agree with the Eternal Sovereign here. We did give you a fair bit of time to end this. But now we don't have the luxury of time anymore. The words landed heavier than any blow. Helmuth felt them settle in his chest as he drew in a sharp breath, the truth of them bitter and unavoidable, as his pride rebelled even as his reason acknowledged the necessity behind them. The agreement had been clear. The conditions had been fair. And he had failed to deliver within them. For a long moment, he said nothing, shoulders rising and falling as he forced his frustration down by sheer will, as though swallowing something corrosive that burned all the way to his gut. Then he let out a loud snort. It was harsh and humorless, more a release of tension than any sign of acceptance, as he turned his gaze away from Morris and Caliph at last and forced his focus back where it belonged, towards Soren. The cult god now stood enclosed within a tightening triangle of inevitability, Morris claiming the left with casual menace, Caliph circling on the right with blades ready and intent sharpened, while Helmuth himself remained directly in front, aura flaring anew as he squared his stance. The fight was no longer his alone. And whether he liked it or not, the others were ready to interfere. Now, all right, but don't blame me if you get in my way and I accidentally injure you. Because I'm not planning on slowing down to accommodate you. Slowpokes, Helmuth warned, as Morris simply grinned wider at his words, while Caliph chose not to react. The Eternal Sovereign's focus locked on his brother alone, as he searched for openings to kill him fast. Huff, long exhale. Letting out a long exhale, Soren put back the normal steel daggers he had used in this fight so far, and instead pulled out his own shiny new origin metal blades, as he gripped them hard and steadied his breath. So you really did have origin metal blades on you, how interesting. Morris commented as soon as he pulled them out, as now, Morris felt even more confused as to why Soren did not pull it out for his clash against Helmuth. When it was literally his ace in the hole. These, Soren began, his voice calm and confident as he showed off his new blades to his enemies. Are called the Grudgekeeper blades, and they carry with them the grievances that my people have faced. Since the great betrayal, Soren spoke, his each word slow and deliberate, as he forced his enemies to listen even when they were not particularly interested in his lore. I did not use them against Helmuth, because simply put, the mindless barbarian is not worthy of me using these blades. But since you three are now planning to shamelessly attack me together, I have no choice but to show you the strength of the cult's combined resolve. If you think you can take me down, come try, but be reminded, a cut from this blade will force you to reckon your sins from here out to eternity, Soren warned, as his words caused a chill to run down the spine of all three gods facing off against him. Not many things genuinely frightened gods like them anymore. However, Soren, and Origin Blades, was just the combination that could still put the fear of mortality back into their divine bodies. Chapter 946 Doubt. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit, Soren's POV. As soon as Soren finished speaking, the three gods moved at once, their trajectories aimed straight for his vitals, as pressure slammed into his perception from three distinct directions. Boom. Shua. Helmuth came first, exactly as Soren expected, the axe descending with reckless commitment and overwhelming force, as Soren twisted his torso and crossed his daggers instinctively, absorbing only part of the impact while letting the rest tear past him, boots skidding across fractured stone as shock ripped through his shoulder. Splat. The blade bit deep, as he felt flesh split and muscle crush. However, it was a calculated trade-off on his part, as while he could recover from wounds inflicted from Helmuth's blade, he could not do the same with Caliph. Block. Parry. Blocking Calip's first dagger with his left blade, Soren rotated his wrist and parried the second aside in the same continuous motion, as he denied the Eternal Sovereign the satisfaction of taking his head clean off. Wham! Morris followed immediately after, his chosen weapon for this exchange nothing more than a raw slab of origin metal wielded as a blunt force instrument, as he brought it down with crushing intent aimed squarely at Soren's upper body. However, as the slab descended, Soren simply let his knees fold and rolled through the narrowing space beneath the strike, his shoulder brushing past the falling mass as displaced air thundered overhead and stone shattered behind him. Crash! By evading the blow so cleanly, Soren threw Morris off balance, as the deceiver's momentum carried him forward and straight into Helmuth's path, disrupting the Berserker god's charge and ruining the timing of his follow-up attack. Thud! The two gods collided briefly, as Helmuth shoved Morris aside without hesitation, his expression darkening as he shot the deceiver a sharp warning glare. Next time you do that, I'll have your head, Helmuth warned, as Morris lifted his hands in a casual, unapologetic gesture, unfazed by the threat. Meanwhile, Caliph never relented, continuing to drive Soren backward step by step, the Eternal Sovereign fully locked into the fight as he pressed the assault with lethal focus, intent on ending his younger brother's life without distraction. Clang! Block! Clang! The two countered one another in seamless succession, movements overlapping before the eye could fully register them, as despite not having crossed blades in over 2 millennia, their bodies still reacted with instinctive familiarity, each anticipating the other's intent as though no time had passed at all. So many years and your fighting style hasn't changed even slightly, brother. Soren jibed, as Kaleth ducked under his attack, before launching a counter. Block. Swoosh. Block. Neither has yours, Cult Master. Kaleth replied, as he countered with a set of jabs of his own that were all either dodged or blocked by Soren. Meanwhile, the monarch commanders in the fourth ring. At the same time as the gods clashed within the core of the Chakravya, Raymond and the demigods began bleeding away a portion of the unbearable strain pressing down on their souls, the redistribution occurring quietly yet relentlessly as the excess burden flowed outward and settled upon those stationed beyond the inner ring. Gasp. Clench. The monarch commanders positioned near the back were the first to feel it take hold, their footing shifting almost imperceptibly as the pressure anchored itself into their bodies, their breathing growing heavier as an unfamiliar weight settled across their limbs and spine. What is this sudden heaviness? They wondered, as at first the pressure manifested itself only as subtle resistance, causing arms that had once moved without conscious effort to now demand deliberate intention, and for muscles that responded instantly to mental commands to now show delay, if only slightly. However, as the seconds passed, the air itself seemed to grow denser. As each breath expanded the lungs only partially before meeting invisible compression, forcing adjustments in breathing rhythm as unease spread through the warriors of the fourth ring. Something's wrong. I feel nauseous all of a sudden. Is the battlefield ahead of us still straight? Why does the ground look like it's tilting to the left? Is this some sort of mental illusion? Did the enemy manage to trap us inside a runic deception field? My armor suddenly feels like it's a couple thousand pounds heavier. I'm really struggling to breathe. They wondered aloud, as even their thought processes began to slow, instinctive sharpness dulling in real time while focus became harder to maintain, as though a fog had begun creeping to their minds. Step. To their growing unease, they remained perfectly aware of the cult army's advance, and of Leo's presence at its forefront. However, with the sensation of peak readiness slipping further away, with every passing second, they no longer felt prepared to face him or the army advancing behind him, as the confidence they had carried moments earlier eroded into something far more fragile. What's going on here? It feels like the runes beneath our feet are the ones putting this pressure on us. But we personally oversaw the construction of those runes. They were made by our men, not the enemy. If not for the explicit orders by the gods to not step outside this runic circle, I'd be rushing out already. This ring feels like it's pressing on my very soul. Could this pressure be generated by Leo Skyshard? Or are we absolutely certain it's coming from beneath our feet? Because the latter would mean the higher-ups might be trying to screw us over. The monarch tier soldiers talked amongst one another, as at this critical juncture of the war where all their focus was meant to be locked on the enemy, they could not help but wonder whether the righteous faction higher-ups were deliberately setting them up for slaughter. As their formation tightened instinctively, shields angling closer together as unspoken suspicion crept between ranks, not toward the enemy ahead, but upward, toward the unseen hands shaping the battlefield. Chapter 947 End of the Road. Meanwhile, Leo's POV. It was roughly 400 meters out from the fourth ring that Leo noticed the shift in the aura of the righteous faction defenders. Step. Halt. Subconsciously, his pace slowed and then stopped entirely, as the phenomenon unfolding ahead felt strange enough that he instinctively paused to study it more carefully, his attention narrowing as something about the scene before him refused to align with his expectations. Sudden halting noises. Confusion. Behind him, the cult army came to an abrupt halt as well, soldiers slowing and stopping in uneven waves, confusion spreading across their faces as none of them understood the reason for the sudden delay. However, since the Lord Shadow Dragon himself had stopped, no one dared question it, as discipline held firm and the army waited in silence for him to move again. The enemy aura, why has it shifted from pure crimson to something muddied with maroon and green? He wondered, as his gaze remained fixed on the monarch defenders ahead. What are they so agitated about? He questioned internally, his eyes narrowing slightly, as upon closer inspection, he noticed clenched jaws and tightened expressions. Across the line, several monarchs visibly grinding their teeth as they maintained formation. There's definitely something wrong with them, but what? He asked himself, as his gaze dropped instinctively to the ground beneath their feet, where below the surface, the runic circle embedded into the fourth ring platform had begun to glow brighter, the symbols pulsing faintly as though they had only recently been fully activated. Oh, he mused quietly, as his attention sharpened, his focus shifting immediately beyond the fourth ring and towards the innermost core of the chakravya, where the gods and demigods maintaining the formation were visibly under immense strain, their auras compressed and unstable as they struggled to hold the structure together. And in that moment, the full picture finally settled into place. "My lord, what's going on? Why have we suddenly stopped?" Commander Mickey James asked from behind him. However, Leo did not turn around. Instead, he raised a single hand, extending one finger slightly as a silent command for Mickey to remain quiet, his attention never leaving the battlefield ahead. So the burden of the chakravya has finally been shifted outward. Leo realized, the pieces locking together in his mind. Which means anyone standing on the fourth ring platform is now being subjected to soul suppression. He continued assessing internally, his expression unchanged. Mickey, myself, and the other monarchs can endure this level of pressure, but the transcendents and those below them won't, he calculated calmly. The moment they step inside that ring, they'll either collapse, or die. He concluded, as his gaze hardened slightly and the implications of that realization settled in, making it clear that he could no longer rely on his army as a unified force. Up until this point in the war, the enemy gods had borne the full weight of the chakravya, which had allowed the cult army to advance without facing any meaningful suppression. However, that was no longer true. With the enemy gods now projecting some of their load outwards. Any living soul, regardless of their tier, stepping onto the fourth ring was bound to experience soul suppression. However, while those at the monarch tier could probably handle that burden, the ones below could not. He mused quietly. This complicates things, he thought, as his focus shifted inward and he began recalculating his next move with renewed caution. On one hand, Leo understood that the best strategy here was to do nothing and let the pressure of holding the formation wear out the monarchs. However, on the other hand, he could also see Soren being overwhelmed by 3 opponents at once, as the cult god looked like he was in desperate need of the chakravya prison being broken apart. Can't take the cult army in. Can't wait for the enemies to wear out. So I guess in the end, breaking the fourth ring is my burden alone. He concluded, as turning around finally, he threw a glance towards Mickey James and the other commanders, his expression firm as he said, "Don't follow me in. The army will struggle and die as soon as they step onto the fourth ring. So I guess this was as far as your battle lasted. I'm proud of each and every one of you for coming with me this far. But sit back, regain your strength, and enjoy the show I'm about to put on from here onwards. For if fate wills, we will save the dragon today," he commanded, as immediately the cult commanders and soldiers frowned in response. "No, my lord. Victory or defeat, we are with you till the end. You cannot deny us the right to charge till we save the dragon. And we simply cannot allow you to charge into a sea of enemies alone." Anderson protested, as the legion commanders behind him nodded in agreement. "We are not cowards, my lord. If you are leading us, we are ready to charge into the jaws of death itself. But please, let us come," a common soldier said, as many behind him nodded their heads in agreement. "Why can't we come though? And if we can't, then why can you go alone?" Mickey asked, as at this point Leo let out a deep sigh, clearly touched by the loyalty of his men, however, annoyed by their persistence nonetheless. "You can't come because the righteous gods are scum beyond belief," Leo said, his voice steady and unyielding. "Right now, they're leeching power directly from the souls of the fourth ring soldiers to sustain the formation confining sect Master Soren, and the moment you step into that runic circle, you become a power source as well," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the assembled ranks. "The runic circle doesn't care who steps onto it. Friend or foe. As long as you're alive and possess a soul, it will drain you all the same." He paused briefly, letting the weight of that truth settle. "I can endure that burden. Most of you cannot. Which is why this is something I have to carry alone, while the rest of you stay here and watch." The explanation struck the cult soldiers hard, the realization rippling through their formation in stunned silence. "Every second from here on matters, so forgive me for giving this order," Leo added, already turning away. Dumpy, stand in front of the army and make sure none of them follow me in. That's an order, Leo said, as he turned and charged, knowing full well that Dumpy would follow his order to death, no matter what it was. Chapter 948 Charging Ahead Alone. Meanwhile, Leo's POV. The moment Leo broke into a full sprint, the world ahead of him narrowed into a single line. The fourth ring loomed closer with every stride, the pressure ahead already beginning to brush against his senses, as his feet struck the ground in steady rhythm. Step, step. Behind him, the cult army surged instinctively, their desire to follow their leader still strong. However, before they could take even a few full steps, they were violently stopped by a loud boom sound. Boom. The ground shook violently as Dumpy leapt forward in a single bound, his massive frame cutting across the army's path as he landed directly between them and the fourth ring, stone cracking beneath his feet as dust and debris burst outward from the impact. Swoosh. Swords slid free from their sheaths in one smooth motion. The blades pointed towards the cult army, as the cult soldiers froze in their tracks all at once. Halt. Having seen Dumpy fight before, none of the cult soldiers dared offend the big green, as more often than not, they had seen him tear through entire legions alone while also shrugging off attacks that should have obliterated entire fortresses as if it were nothing. I want to follow the Shadow Dragon. However, I don't want to fight the big green. Many of them thought, as regardless of how strongly they wanted to follow Leo, none of them dared approach Dumpy alone. You heard what Lord Father said, Dumpy declared, his voice carrying easily over the stunned formation, heavy and absolute as his grip tightened around his blades. Dare approach me. He raised his sword slightly, the metal catching the light as his stance settled, feet digging into the ground with finality. And I swear I won't hold back my strength, whether it be used on friend or foe. He swore, as stunned silence followed. No one moved, not because they lacked courage, but because they understood. This was not a threat. It was a statement. Dumpy's gaze swept across the ranks, unyielding and calm, as his presence alone pressed down upon them, his intent so clear that even the most hot-headed among them felt it settle into their bones. He would not let them pass. Not even if they begged or cursed him, not even if they tried to force their way through. This was his duty, and he was prepared to fulfill it to the bitter end, just because his Lord Father had commanded it of him. Meanwhile, behind him, Leo continued forward without looking back, one arm clutching Molthorak's aura orb while the other held a dagger, as a clear strategy began to solidify in his mind. If I turn the battle inside the fourth ring into a contest of endurance instead of head-on strength, then I'm bound to outlast these jokers eventually. He thought, as his focus locked onto entering the fourth ring and crushing Molthorak's orb, as his intention was to ramp up the pressure inside that zone to its absolute limit, as he planned to convert the chaotic melee into a brutal test of who could remain standing the longest. However, the plan proved far easier to conceive than to execute, as the moment he stepped into the fourth ring, the formation's soul-draining pressure crashed down on him as well, causing his breath to be pushed downward, as his breathing slowed under a sudden wave of strain. Crush. As planned, Leo crushed Molthorak's second orb the instant he crossed fully into the fourth ring, as the containment spell collapsed outright and the ancient dragon's true pressure burst outward without restraint, its suppressed presence finally freed, as it unleashed its havoc in its entirety. FWOOSH. Thrum. There was no delay or gradual release, as the pressure detonated outward in a single violent surge, Molthorak's unsealed aura slamming into the fourth ring and colliding head-on with the already active soul-draining force of the Chakravya, as the two pressures stacked instead of canceling, before amplifying into something far more punishing than either alone. Boom. The ground beneath Leo fractured audibly, stone splintering as the combined force crushed downward, while his breath was ripped from his lungs in a harsh exhale, his chest compressing as though an immense weight had settled directly onto his ribs and spine. His steps slowed, not from hesitation, but because every movement now demanded conscious effort, as even his monarch-tier body was forced to acknowledge the severity of the pressure bearing down on both flesh and soul, while all around him, the fourth ring descended into chaos. Not a single righteous commander remained standing calmly anymore, their legs wobbling as their composure finally broke. Some dropped to one knee while others braced themselves with weapons driven into the ground, armor creaking as bones and joints protested under the compounded weight. Pant. Short breath. Breathing grew ragged across the ring, while blood spilled freely, as noses ruptured under internal pressure, ears rang violently, and vision blurred for many, balance collapsing as Multhorax's ancient authority pressed directly into their cores. This pressure. Someone gasped, words barely forming as their voice cracked under strain. The soul suppression of the Chakravya pulled relentlessly from below, while Multhorax's unleashed presence crushed from above, leaving no direction unopposed and no space to recover, as bodies trembled and instincts screamed that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Even Leo felt it. His vision doubled for a moment as he clenched his jaw and forced his breathing into rhythm, muscles tightening as he pushed back against the pressure trying to pin him in place, sweat forming along his brow as his body adjusted in real time. So this is what it feels like when your soul, mind and body are pushed to the limit at once, he thought, as his steps resumed, slower but unbroken, dagger flashing into his grip as he charged forward alone, fully aware that from this point onward, the fourth ring would not forgive hesitation, weakness, or mercy from anyone who remained within it. Chapter 949 Leo Skyshard. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit, Leo's POV. Clang, clang, swoosh. The moment Leo entered the fourth ring, enemy monarchs closed in from every direction, weapons and spells already in motion, as the engagement erupted into violent chaos almost instantly. Wind blast hurricane, dragon slaying slash, volcanic fire blast, thundering panther slash, boom, blast, slash, kaboom. A storm of attacks swallowed the space around him, forcing Leo to react without pause, as he triggered storm flash traverse and tore through the overlapping trajectories in rapid succession. Zoop, swap. He threaded through the onslaught with razor-thin precision, shifting positions again and again, before activating Aura Shield, as the technique immediately dampened the pressure he felt under Multhorax's aura. Deep inhale. Spine straightening. Relief followed almost at once, his breathing stabilizing and his posture correcting as the pressure became manageable enough to allow fluid movement again. However, while he moved faster and smoother, the monarchs around him visibly faltered, their strength steadily leaking away under the compounded suppression. Don't let him slip. Show some courage and pin him down. Someone bind him. They shouted over the din of battle, voices strained and uneven, as each of them fought desperately against the double burden of the fourth ring and Multhorax's presence, exhaustion clear on every face, as although they unleashed attacks, it was clear from their expressions that each movement took a lot out of their stamina. Reserves. Shua. Crack. A blade swept through the space Leo had occupied a heartbeat earlier, missing by a margin so thin that displaced air tore at his cloak, as sixth sense flared and intent lines burned across his perception, crimson threads snapping into existence to map trajectories before they were fully committed. Shift. Leo twisted sideways mid-step, letting a crescent of fire scream past his ribs, as his foot found ground and, enhanced, surged through his legs, the burst of force hurling him forward and out of the forming kill zone. Boom. The ground behind him detonated as overlapping spells collided, fragments of scorched stone and molten debris erupting upward, while Leo was already gone, his figure blurring as Fade Step carried him cleanly behind one of the casters. Slice. His dagger flashed once. Thud. A monarch collapsed before he even realized Leo had slipped past his guard, head separating cleanly as Leo performed crown fall in a single, efficient motion, blood misting the air before the body hit the ground. Behind us. Don't let him get space. Close ranks, now. They tried to tighten the formation, dragging themselves closer together despite the pressure crushing down on their souls, shields rising and weapons angling inward as they attempted to deny Leo maneuvering room. Clang, clang. Leo deflected a spear strike and twisted away from a hammer blow, sparks bursting as metal met metal, his movements precise and economical as he refused to commit to any exchange that might let them surround him. Shua. A wave of compressed wind tore across the ring. Leo dropped low, sliding beneath it as storm flash traversed chained again, carrying him from one safe pocket to the next, his feet barely touching the ground as he moved between pre-selected angles. Zoop. Swap. A monarch lunged to intercept him. But unfortunately for him, he was too slow, as Leo slipped past the strike, shoulder brushing close enough that he could smell scorched mana on the man's armor, before pivoting sharply and driving his blade upward. Crack. The strike pierced the enemy underneath his chin, ending the fight. Instantly, as the body stiffened and collapsed backward, weapon clattering uselessly onto the stone. Clang, clatter. 2 down, don't panic. Hold your ground. The men shouted as they kept fighting. As to their credit, they did not break despite the overwhelming environment. As despite heaving short breaths and trembling limbs, the righteous faction monarchs continued to unleash attacks tearing through the ring as they tried to force Leo into a corner, detonations chaining together in violent succession. Boom, boom, kaboom. However, unfortunately for them, Leo weaved through the chaos. Never stopping, never committing to a straight line, his aura shield keeping his mind clear even as his body absorbed the strain of constant movement, as he kept slipping out of traps and corners. Wham! A blade grazed his side. Pain flared. However, Leo twisted with it instead of resisting, rolling away from the impact as he spun and vanished again. Fade step. He reappeared behind another monarch, dagger already descending. Slice. As the man fell with his throat slit. Glurb. Thud. Moving swiftly, Leo readjusted his stance, eyes scanning the battlefield as intent lines multiplied across his vision, the ring alive with hostility and danger, as dozens of enemies closed in despite their failing bodies. Too many to stop at once. He thought calmly, as sixth sense pulsed again. Need to keep moving, he analyzed, as he moved. His intention not being to break the formation all at once, but rather to just keep piling the kill count just 1 kill at a time. As he knew that given enough time, the double suppression of the Chakravya and Molthorax aura will do what he alone cannot need to endure for now. The longer this battle lasts, the more openings I'll see and the faster I'll be able to kill them. Need to take minimal risks for now, and keep the kill pace up. He concluded, as he proceeded to do exactly that for the next 15 minutes. Dodge. Block kill. Repeat. As again and again and again, he kept evading the enemy's attacks. Slipping through broken formations and fractured intent lines, taking one life at a time while refusing to be cornered, as the fourth ring slowly became a place where he controlled the tempo of the battlefield alone. What's going on? How can he move so freely when we can barely take a few steps? The righteous monarchs wondered aloud, as it was at this point in the battle where they realized that although they were all considered elite amidst the righteous faction, none of them truly matched up to the monarch named Leo Skyshard. Chapter 950 Belief. Meanwhile, on neutral worlds across the universe, hidden cult supporters POV. The execution livestream was played across the universe, and the various neutral worlds were no exception, as even on special merchant planets or barren mining worlds, the execution livestream was played on big screens with thousands gathering to watch it live. Amidst the crowd, blended amongst neutral planet locals, righteous faction traitors, and wanted mercenaries, the cult commoners joined in to watch the livestream as well, as although they masqueraded as righteous citizens to avoid being exposed as cult sympathizers, in their hearts they remained loyal to the cult. They stood quietly among the masses, faces carefully composed and postures relaxed, as the image of the fourth ring filled the screens, showing Leo moving alone amidst a sea of monarch-tier enemies, his figure small yet unmistakable at the center of overwhelming chaos. Boom. Thrum. Kaboom. As explosions lit up the battlefield and righteous monarchs fell one after another, the hidden cult supporters felt their pulses quicken, as something fierce and undeniable stirred within them. Clench. Gulp. They did not shout or gasp like the civilians around them, as they understood the danger of being noticed, yet their clenched fists and shallow breaths betrayed what words could not, as pride and exhilaration surged through their veins at the sight of their lord standing alone. Initially, when Leo had charged towards the enemy alone, they had all felt genuinely worried for his safety. However, as the battle progressed and minutes passed, it became clear to them that their lord was not in danger, but rather was the danger. Am I really not dreaming? Or is the lord really taking on an army of monarchs alone? They wondered, as Leo continued to weave through attacks meant to annihilate entire legions while also advancing despite pressure that crippled others. That's the power of the cult's teachings. That's the bloodline of the timeless assassin. The hidden cult citizens thought, as belief hardened inside them that the old prophecy was indeed true. For generations they had all heard about how the timeless assassin would rise once again to lead the cult to its former glory. However, as the centuries continued to pass, more and more individuals began to doubt the authenticity of that old tale, which was why, watching Leo fight today, the doubts they had once carried were all burned away, as they felt their faith in the old tale being restored. Please go on, Lord. Go on and kill all those heartless bastards who have suppressed us for so long. They prayed, as some remembered the nights spent hiding from the local authorities, while others remembered families lost to purges and accusations, as watching Leo fight became more than a spectacle for most, as it turned into proof that their faith had not been misplaced, nor their suffering meaningless. As the livestream continued and murmurs of confusion spread among righteous-aligned spectators, the cult supporters felt something settle permanently in their souls, as they became certain that the modern dragon candidates still carried within them the potential to become the next timeless assassin, if only they lived long enough to reach that destiny. Meanwhile, Chaosbringer and Amanda. Meanwhile on planet Ixtal, inside the temporary Skyshard quarters, Amanda and Chaosbringer also watched the execution livestream on a small TV, the two of them standing close enough to the screen that neither could bring themselves to look away even if they wanted to. Chaosbringer hovered restlessly beside the display, long nails caught between his teeth as his eyes tracked every violent movement on the screen, his body reacting instinctively to each explosion as though the shockwaves might spill out of the broadcast and strike him next. Boom! Gasp! Every time fire or debris swallowed Leo's figure, Chaosbringer gasped sharply, breath hitching in his chest as his fingers curled tighter against his lips, panic flashing openly across his face before he could even think to suppress it. And then the smoke would clear. And Leo would still be standing. As each time it happened, Chaosbringer released a long, shaky exhale, shoulders sagging with visible relief as his heart slowed, only for the tension to coil back into place moments later when another blast rocked the fourth ring. Tap, tap. He shifted his weight from foot to foot without awareness as his gaze remained glued to the screen, reactions exaggerated and unguarded, as though containing them would somehow tempt fate into striking harder. While in complete contrast to him, Amanda stood beside him without moving at all. With an unflinching expression and folded arms, she watched her husband fight alone against overwhelming odds, as she tried her best to keep her cool. Unlike Chaosbringer, she did not flinch when explosions tore through the fourth ring, nor did her breath change when Leo vanished beneath collapsing stone or surging mana, her eyes never leaving the screen even for a moment, as she remained stoic, not because she did not care for Leo, but rather because she cared too much. Amanda understood that the moment she allowed fear to surface, it would open the door to something she could not afford to face while Leo was still fighting, and so she held herself together through sheer will, keeping every emotion locked firmly in place, as she watched in silence instead. "Honey, please stay safe," she hoped secretly, as beneath that calm exterior, where no one else could see, she prayed relentlessly for Leo's safe return, clinging to faith as tightly as Chaosbringer clung to the screen, trusting that the man she loved would survive what the universe had chosen to throw at him. If this is the path you chose, then walk it without regret, no matter where it leads you. She thought tightly, as she fixed her gaze on the screen and anchored herself to resolve rather than fear, accepting that this was not a moment to beg fate for mercy, but one to trust the strength of the man who had already decided to bear the weight of the cult's future alone. Chapter 951 Permanent Damage. Meanwhile, inside the heart of the Chakravia, Soren's POV. Across his vast lifespan, Soren vividly remembered participating in some of the most bloody and brutal battles history had ever witnessed. However, everything he had experienced so far paled in comparison to the difficulty he faced today. As of all the battles he had fought, as a mortal and as a god, this one today was undoubtedly the hardest. Pant, pant, block. Blocking yet another swing from Helmuth, Soren shifted his weight backwards, as old injuries and limping ankles caught up to him, his body threatening to lose all sense of balance, while his will forced it to stay functioning. Not yet, not now, he thought, as he kept an eye out for Leo's progress just beyond the inner ring of the Chakravia, and realized that the boy was less than an hour away from making it to the core. Must endure till he's here, Soren resolved, as he kept the rising pressure from three distinct fronts at bay. From a purely technical standpoint, it was a miracle that he had even endured this far into the fight without picking up any new major injuries, for his opponents were some of the strongest gods in the universe, and yet, the reason behind why he managed to do it was less because of his own merit and more because the enemy gods were terrible at working together. Helmuth fought like a storm given form, His axe swings wide and devastating, each strike carrying enough raw power to shatter divine constructs, yet his movements were blunt and predictable, driven by rage rather than coordination, as he repeatedly overextended and left openings that Soren exploited to slip away. Morris, on the other hand, fought with a cruel sort of opportunism, his slab of origin metal coming down whenever he sensed weakness, yet his timing was erratic, as he prioritized disruption over precision, often forcing Helmuth or Kalith to adjust mid-attack, just to avoid being struck by their own ally. While Kalith, while being the most sensible fighter, showed a likeliness to overwhelm Soren's personal space, as while he did not interrupt others, his body positioning often left no room for Helmuth or Morris to attack Soren's vitals, as he became an involuntary meat shield for Soren. The three pillars of the universal government, while all overwhelmingly dangerous as individual fighters, failed to translate that strength into true coordination, as it was precisely their lack of cohesion that allowed Soren to endure for far longer than he should have. Block. Step. That flaw manifested clearly on the battlefield itself, where their assaults interfered with one another at critical moments, as Helmuth's axe repeatedly forced Morris to abort killing swings, while Morris's slab disrupted Kalith's lines of attack, and as Kalith's positioning in turn compelled Helmuth to restrain his own strikes to avoid cutting down an ally. Clang! Soren turned Helmuth's axe aside at the last moment, letting the edge scrape his shoulder deliberately, as pain flared and blood spilled, yet the wound immediately began sealing itself, his regeneration kicking in with extreme efficiency, as that was a price he was willing to pay. Helmuth's axe hurt, but it did not linger, while Kalith's daggers did. Swoosh! Step! Soren pivoted away from a descending slab, feeling the displaced air of Morris's strike brush past his ribs, as the weapon smashed into the ground behind him and forced Morris to wrench it free with a grunt of irritation. "Stay still, damn you," Morris snapped, his voice sharp with mounting frustration. Soren did not reply, because talking required breath, and breath was a resource he could not afford to waste, not while three gods tried to tear him apart at the same time. Arghhhhhh. Helmuth roared and charged again, boots cracking stone as he closed the distance, and Soren angled his body just enough that the axe passed close, forcing Kalith to pause his own attack for a fraction of a second to avoid being clipped. "Control yourself," Kalith said coldly, irritation seeping into his tone despite his composure. "Don't tell me how to fight," Helmuth shot back, shoving past him, the two colliding shoulder to shoulder as their momentum clashed. Thud! That single moment was enough. Soren slipped between them, blades low and tight, as he repositioned with minimal movement, preserving strength while forcing the three to reorient once again, their lack of cohesion buying him another precious second of survival. Pant. His breathing grew heavier, chest burning as fatigue crept deeper into his limbs, as centuries-old wounds protested the strain of constant motion, yet Soren kept moving, because stopping meant death, and death meant the end of everything his cult believers were fighting for. Outside the ring, Kalith adjusted first. His daggers flashed, cutting through the narrow gap Soren had just vacated, forcing Soren to twist hard to the side, muscles screaming as his footing slipped on shattered stone. Helmuth followed immediately, axe coming down in a brutal vertical arc, as Soren raised both blades to meet it, the impact sending a violent shock through his arms and rattling his bones. Crack! Soren staggered, pain blooming across his forearms, as his grip threatened to fail for the first time since the battle began. Careful, he warned himself, as Morris moved in at the same time, slab swinging low with the clear intent to break his legs and end his mobility for good. Jump! Soren leapt backward, the edge of the slab grazing his calf as pain flared, teeth grinding together as he absorbed it, knowing that even partial injuries were beginning to stack faster than his body could comfortably handle. Still standing, Morris laughed, though there was no humor in his eyes. "Your head is mine," Helmuth growled. Kalith said nothing, but his gaze sharpened, as Soren could feel the shift in pressure that came when Kalith decided to escalate. The next exchange happened faster. Kalith's first dagger slipped past Soren's guard, slicing deep across his forearm, origin metal biting into flesh in a way that immediately resisted healing, pain detonating up his arm as Soren hissed through clenched teeth. Before he could fully react, the second dagger followed, carving across his stomach in a brutal diagonal slash, tearing muscle and skin apart as blood poured freely, the wound refusing to close no matter How hard Soren focused. Gasp. His body recoiled on instinct, balance faltering as the realization of permanent damage hit him like a hammer. Kalith stepped in, poised to finish it. And in that instant, Soren understood that retreat meant death, that hesitation meant collapse, and that the only path forward was through pain. So he stepped into it. Ignoring the agony screaming from his wounds, Soren twisted his torso and drove his blade upward in a vicious arc, not toward Kalith's throat, but toward his face, because that was the one body part their father forbid them to hit during friendly sparring and hence was the one part that they naturally never learned how to defend. Shrrrk. The blade tore across Kalith's face from forehead to chin, slashing past his eyes and lips, blood spraying as Kalith staggered backward, his composure shattering for the first time as a sound escaped him that was half snarl, half gasp. Garg. The wound did not fade. It did not heal. It remained. Kalith retreated, his feet moving sideways in escape, while his fingertips hovered near his face without touching it, eyes wide with disbelief as pain and permanence settled in. My eyes. Kalith thought, as a searing, liquid agony bloomed across his face and burrowed inward, the origin blade's mark burning with a permanence he immediately recognized. The cut had grazed his eye, not enough to blind him, yet enough that every blink sent waves of torment through his skull, vision shimmering at the edges as he realized with dawning horror that this pain would never fade, never dull, and never heal. Do I have to bear this pain for an eternity now? He wondered, as the realization struck him harder than the pain itself, as he understood that the mark carved across his face would never fade, no matter how much time passed or power he wielded. This war, which he had entered with absolute certainty and control, had finally left him with something permanent, as the consequences of crossing blades with Soren settled into him at last, not as fear, but as the knowledge that this damage would follow him for the rest of his existence. Chapter 952 Guilty Pleasures. After getting injured by Soren once, Kalith did not rush back into the battle to exact his revenge, as instead he paused to gather his thoughts, staring at the fresh red blood dripping from his cheek and pooling into his palms, the warmth of it unfamiliar in a way that unsettled him far more than the pain itself. Blood, my blood, Kalith thought, as for the first time in centuries he felt disturbingly mortal again, the consequences of this fight crystallizing in his mind as the fear of death surfaced in a form he had long forgotten. I will make you pay for this, brother. He thought soon after, as his gaze shifted back toward Soren, who was now struggling more visibly with the two fresh wounds Kalith had carved into his body. Unlike Kalith's bright crimson blood, Soren bled a thick, brown-black tar from his cuts, the color alone revealing the severity of the origin metal poisoning that had accumulated within his bloodstream over the years, rotting his body from the inside out. Clang, clang, slash. And yet, unlike Kalith, who felt constantly dragged down by the lingering pain burning across his face, Soren showed no such hesitation, as despite limping and struggling to maintain his grip on his blades, he continued pushing back relentlessly, his expression stoic and unmoved, as though the injuries meant nothing at all. How can you be so indifferent when I've damaged you forever, brother? Kalith wondered, unable to grasp that Soren had entered this battle already convinced he would not walk out of it alive. Which was precisely why a few more permanent wounds did not matter to him in the slightest, so long as his body could still move, and his hands could still strike back. Meanwhile, inside the innermost ring of the Chakravia, Raymond watched his father bleed with evident shock written all across his face, as a complex flood of emotions poured through him all at once, his breath catching as his eyes locked onto the fresh scar carved across Kalith's face. For a brief, shameful moment, something warm and vicious sparked inside his chest. Take that, you sick bastard, he thought, as the image of Kalith recoiling burned itself into his mind. The sight of that perfect, untouchable face finally marked sending a surge of vindictive satisfaction through him that he had never allowed himself to feel before. Yet that feeling did not come alone. Almost immediately, confusion followed, as Raymond's thoughts spiraled toward consequences rather than pleasure, as he wondered whether this injury would make his father less imposing in the eyes of the universe, or whether a visible flaw would weaken the myth that had kept everyone in line for so long, as although he wasn't worried about his father, he did feel worried for his own influence becoming muted by association. If he looks less invincible, then what does that mean for me? He wondered uneasily, as his gaze flicked between Caliph and the countless gods watching his downfall like vultures. But as the seconds passed, and Raymond saw how Caliph still stood tall despite the pain, how his aura remained suffocating and his presence remained unchanged, realization dawned that this wound was not a collapse of authority, but a different kind of punishment entirely. Permanent, painful, enduring, and harmless to Caliph's rule as the eternal sovereign, as that realization calmed his anxiety to a great degree. The unease faded, replaced instead by a slow, satisfied calm, as his lips curled upward into a smile he did not bother to suppress. I'm glad it happened, he thought simply, as the mark across Caliph's face felt less like a threat to the order of things and more like a reminder that even monsters could be made to suffer. Nearby, Yukiro observed the scene in silence, his expression composed as always, yet his eyes lingered on Caliph's blood just a fraction longer than necessary, a subtle shift that betrayed his true thoughts far more clearly than words ever could. Though none of the great clan gods spoke, a quiet, shared understanding passed between them, as faint smiles tugged at the corners of their lips, restrained yet unmistakable, each of them savoring the sight in their own way. I hope you both kill each other today. Yukiro prayed inwardly, his thoughts steady and calculating, as he imagined a universe without Caliph's suffocating shadow looming over every decision made by the great clans. That would be the most ideal outcome, he mused, as he pictured a power vacuum wide enough for the great clans to finally step forward and claim universal domination. As much as you believe that you're better than the timeless assassin, the reality is that you're not. We follow you because you're a leader of convenience, not because you're a leader we respect or fear. And it's about time someone put you in your place. Yukiro thought, as his gaze drifted away from Caliph's bleeding face and returned to Soren standing at the heart of the Chakravia, as he thought about how the choice the great clan leaders had made earlier was undoubtedly the right one. Thank God we haven't fought this demon in the past 2,250 years. He's still got it, he thought, as the implications of that realization settled heavily in his chest, his fingers curling slowly at his side while he imagined what this battlefield would look like if he, or any of the other great clan gods, had been standing where Helmuth and Morris now were. As he watched Soren continue to fight despite a body that should have collapsed long ago, Yukiro felt a rare sense of relief wash over him, as he acknowledged that power like this was not something meant to be tested lightly, nor confronted unless absolutely necessary. As battered and corroded as Soren was, he was still dictating the flow of the battle, still forcing gods to bleed and hesitate, and that alone convinced Yukiro that avoiding direct confrontation with him over the years had not been cowardice but brilliance. Let the old monsters tear each other apart, he thought calmly, as he resolved that no matter how this battle ended, the great clans would never willingly place themselves in Soren's path, for the man was too dangerous even at the edge of death. Chapter 953 Total Domination. 15 minutes later, Leo's paw, the fourth ring. It was around the 30-minute mark since he first entered the fourth ring that Leo began to observe a humongous dip in the performance of the monarchs surrounding him, as the pressure that had been steadily accumulating finally crossed a threshold that their bodies and minds could no longer compensate for. At first it showed itself subtly, as movements lost sharpness and intent lines wavered instead of snapping cleanly into place, as swings arrived a fraction slower than before and spells took just a little longer to form. Then it became undeniable. Breathing grew strained and uneven across the battlefield, chests heaving as though the air itself had turned thick and resistant, while vision blurred under the relentless spiritual weight pressing down on them from all directions, the Chakravia grinding at their foundations while Multhorak's presence crushed what remained of their composure. Leo felt it through their attacks. Where once the fourth ring had been a storm of overlapping trajectories and layered killing intent, now gaps appeared everywhere, angles opening where none should exist, as coordination frayed and monarchs struggled simply to remain upright, let alone maintain formation. One staggered mid-charge, weapon slipping from his fingers as his legs failed him without warning. Another raised a shield too late, arm trembling violently as numbness crept up from his fingertips and into his shoulder. A third tried to retreat, only to misjudge distance and stumble, eyes unfocused as dizziness overtook him. As it was not the pressure that had increased, but rather their will that had weakened, as after enduring the pressure for so long, their bodies and minds finally reached a point where they could no longer hold on anymore. Cover my left, I can't lift the shield anymore. I can't cover your left. My eyes don't work anymore. Are we even alive? Or is this heaven? The monarchs muttered, as they transcended the realm of normalcy and stepped into the world of delusion. On the other hand, although Leo felt a faint, lingering strain, he found himself operating close to peak condition, as enduring Multhorax pressure had been far more taxing for him when he was forced to shield the entire cult army advancing behind him through the fourth dimension. However, now, with that burden gone and the pressure no longer needing to be redirected or dispersed, he only had himself to protect, allowing his movements to flow freely and his stamina to stabilize as the weight became something he could manage rather than resist. All right, he thought calmly, watching a spell detonate several meters wide of its intended target. They're clearly at their limits now, so I guess we can start picking up some real speed. He concluded, as he slowed his breathing and let his shoulders drop, the battlefield around him finally starting to move at a pace he could dictate rather than endure. Step, step, slash. Stepping forward instead of maneuvering around blasts, he tightened his fighting line to be something more direct and efficient, as he began to rack up dozens of kills every passing minute. Ah! A monarch screamed as he lunged at him, desperation written plainly across his face. However, unfortunately for him, his movements proved to be too sluggish and slow, as Leo passed him in a blur, blade flashing once as he severed the man's head from his shoulder. Thud! Pivoting immediately, Leo cut through another who barely managed to raise his weapon halfway to block, as the fatigue and delusion made him too slow to be an efficient combatant. Slash! Another fell. Then another. Then another. As where earlier Leo had needed to be careful about his positioning to avoid being surrounded, now he carved through clusters of monarchs who could no longer react in time, each swing carrying him forward as resistance thinned rapidly around him. Attacks dwindled, and the battlefield started to turn quiet, not from peace, but from exhaustion, as Leo advanced through the fourth ring like a blade through rotting fabric, taking complete control of the tempo as bodies dropped faster than they could be replaced, the monarchs finally learning what it meant to be on the wrong side of a battle decided by endurance. He's cutting through us like we are nothing. What sort of sorcery is this? Why is he not affected by this mind-numbing pressure as well? Ah, fuck this shit. I'm out of this fourth ring. I did not work so hard all my life to become a reputable monarch, just to die here for nothing. The monarchs said, as they could not fathom as to how Leo was so far superior to them, as they realized that the fight from here on out was no longer about containment but rather survival. We can't stop the cult's shadow dragon. I suggest laying down our weapons and letting him pass. Are you mad? This war is being live-streamed across the universe. If you lay down your weapon now, you will be branded as a traitor across the cosmos. Not to mention that you might be captured and punished for defection. I don't know if you've heard the horror stories or not, but apparently, Lord Morris takes a lot of pleasure in torturing traitors. And I would much rather die here a righteous faction hero, than risk torture at the hands of the Lord. The monarchs discussed in broken, slurred whispers as panic spread faster than any command ever could, yet their indecision mattered little, because by that point Leo had already begun tearing through them at a pace that no argument or resolve could interrupt. Over the next 10 minutes, the fourth ring collapsed into slaughter, as thousands of elite righteous faction monarchs fell one after another, their titles and reputations stripped of meaning as their bodies piled up beneath Leo's path, unable to slow him even for a moment. With every step forward, his momentum compounded, movements growing cleaner and more ruthless, as enemies ceased to feel like opponents and became little more than idle bodies standing in his way. Blades rose too late. Spells failed to complete. Resistance vanished. As by the time the survivors realized the fourth ring had already been lost, Leo no longer seemed to be fighting a battle at all, but rather seemed like he was walking through the remains of one. Chapter 954 Pandemonium. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit, the Fourth Ring. After picking up serious momentum, it took Leo under 30 minutes to wipe out the fourth ring as a whole, as he turned into a bloodthirsty demon who cut everything that moved in his path. Slash. Thud. As the last monarch fell and the space ahead of him finally opened up, the battlefield did not settle into silence, nor did it offer even a moment of relief, because the instant the fourth ring ceased to exist as a stabilizing layer, the war reached its true breaking point. The most immediate consequence was the pressure. With the fourth ring erased, the burden of the Chakravya shifted inward once again. the massive weight that had been distributed across several initial layers now collapsing toward the core, as the formation attempted to rebalance itself under a load it was never designed to bear for long. For the cult army following behind Leo, the moment was iconic, as a wave of exhilaration swept through their ranks as realization spread that their lord had accomplished something that should have been impossible, that he had survived and triumphed in a one-versus-all battle against tens of thousands of monarchs, a feat that shattered every expectation they had grown up believing. Deafening cheers. Emphatic roar. Weapons banging. Cheers erupted across the battlefield. Roars of devotion echoed through the third dimension as cult. Soldiers screamed Leo's name, weapons raised high as their morale surged to its absolute peak, disbelief and pride mixing into a feverish celebration that threatened to drown out all reason. However, their voices were insignificant compared to what came next. Because as the fourth ring vanished, the Chakravya did not merely tighten. It reacted. A violent pressure surge rippled outward from the innermost structure, a catastrophic backlash as the formation attempted to redistribute energy that no longer had anywhere to go, causing the fourth and third dimensions to grind violently against one another. Thrum MMM. GRRRSHHHHH. The air screamed. Space distorted. And within seconds, the innermost ring began to destabilize, as the three demi-gods anchoring the core of the formation trembled under the sudden load, their souls reaching their limits, as the pressure climbing within the innermost ring became unbearable even for them. Oh no. Oh fuck no. Raymond muttered in a panicked voice, as he felt the sudden weight of 50 mountains being placed on his shoulders with a violence that felt less like suppression and more like suffocation. I definitely can't take this for long, or I'll be crushed alive. He concluded, as while the Chakravya demanded that he try to balance its core principles by taking on the pressure meant to endure by tens of thousands of monarchs alone, he found himself grossly incapable of actually doing so. Choke. Step. Clarence was the first to falter, his posture breaking as the sudden load crushed down on his circuits, veins bulging along his neck as blood leaked from the corners of his eyes, his aura spasming erratically as the formation demanded an output that a demi-god's soul was never meant to sustain alone. As incapable of doing so, he stepped out of the inner ring. Thrum. Crack. Terrence followed a heartbeat later, teeth clenched hard enough to crack, breath hitching as the pressure wrapped around his chest and skull simultaneously, his vision tunneling as his knees threatened to give out, instinct screaming louder than pride as survival overtook obedience, forcing him to step out as well. Thrum MMM. CRAAACK. Raymond became the last to step out, but the impact of him doing so hit the Chakravya the deepest. For the moment he did, the Chakravya screamed. Kablam! With 3 of its 8 anchors removed, the formation lurched violently as it attempted to redistribute the entire load onto the remaining 5 gods, pressure surging erratically as the structure strained to maintain coherence under a demand it was never designed to endure alone. For a fraction of a second, it failed. Hairline fractures tore through the barrier, invisible seams ripping open as momentary gaps flickered into existence, spatial inconsistencies where the fourth and third dimensions failed to overlap cleanly, the formation stuttering as it tried and failed to correct itself in real time. Inside the core, Soren felt it instantly. The suffocating suppression loosened in pulses, his senses flaring as freedom brushed against his awareness for the first time since the battle began, his battered body reacting before conscious thought could catch up, as he noticed a gap instantly. There, he thought, as Helmuth's axe came screaming toward him in a wide, rage-driven arc, the weapon howling through distorted space as it aimed to cleave him in half. However, this time, instead of blocking it, Soren leaned back, the blade missing him by mere millimeters, as rather than trying to counter or reposition, Soren took the chance to burst straight through the fleeting gap that had opened in the Chakravya's barrier, his body twisting midair as he slipped between dimensions and tore himself free from the formation's grasp. Step. Gasp. Almost, at the same moment in time as he crossed the boundary, the restrictions preventing him from stepping into the fourth dimension vanished, as he hit the ground outside the core hard, boots skidding across cracked stone as his breath tore free from his lungs in a ragged gasp, while the confident glint in his eyes returned as the oppressive weight that had been crushing him for so long ceased to exist. Free to walk between the seconds at last, he muttered, as behind him, chaos erupted. With him no longer being contained, the 5 great clan gods were forced to react, instinct overriding strategy as they stepped back from the collapsing core almost in unison, unwilling to remain inside a formation that was actively tearing itself apart, in what became the final blow for the Chakravya. Thrum mmm. Bam. Asterisk. Deprived of all of its anchors, the Chakravya could no longer sustain itself, as the structure shuddered violently as its dimensional framework destabilized completely, the fourth dimension losing cohesion as it ground against the third without restraint. Kaboom! Space folded inward, then outward, the boundary between dimensions rupturing as the third and fourth dimensions collided violently, shockwaves ripping across the battlefield as reality itself convulsed, the sky fracturing into overlapping layers of distorted light while the ground buckled beneath the strain. On the pit, distant mountains and volcanic rings trembled, as the planet itself began to scream. The clash between dimensions rattling the divine planet to its core, as it began vibrating like a hot metal ball left over a layer of ice. Violent earthquake. For a moment, every mortal left alive on the pit stumbled to their knees, as they were forced to hold on to the ground below them so as to not be violently tossed aside. However, as if that wasn't enough, a blinding surge of energy tore through the battlefield next as the Chakravya collapsed in its entirety, dimensional pressure exploding outward before snapping back into place as the third and fourth dimensions fused once more, in a phenomenon that ensured that the war crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. Chapter 955 Saved. Or Not. Execution Livestream Continuation, The Pit, Leo's POV. For a moment, even Leo could not track what was unfolding before his eyes, as the speed at which gods moved was something far beyond his mortal comprehension. Unlike the others, he was not blinded by the big flash, nor rattled by the massive earthquake gripping the planet, and yet, he could still not get a grasp of everything unfolding before him, for such was the chaotic state of his surroundings. For the briefest of moments, he felt as though he saw Soren skidding onto solid ground just outside the core of the Chakravya. However, in the instant between that thought and his next blink, everything changed, as Soren and every other god vanished from the battlefield, already locked in a clash unfolding on the very edge of reality itself. SHLICK. Boom. Blast. Within a split second, a chain of explosions erupted dozens of kilometers beyond the shattered core, drawing Leo's gaze instinctively, but by the time his eyes focused on the devastation, the battlefield had already shifted again, leaving behind nothing but scorched land, fractured terrain, and lingering traces of divine aura hanging in the air. Sigh. Give them hell, cult master. Leo thought, as he wasted no more time trying to follow the battle between gods, as instead, he immediately diverted his attention toward Ver, who now knelt alone on the abandoned execution platform, utterly ignored amidst the chaos consuming the battlefield. From the stunned expression frozen on Ver's face, it was clear that the cult dragon had no idea how to process this sudden reversal of fate, for while he had once hoped and prayed that somehow, someway, someone might come to save him, he had long since accepted that no such miracle would arrive. He had already made peace with dying. Which was why, when he finally saw Leo charging toward him to break his restraints, the emotional weight of that moment crashed down all at once, and before he could stop himself, tears spilled freely as his mind struggled to comprehend that he was still alive. I can be saved. Ver thought, as the realization settled gently into his mind, not like a shock, but like warmth spreading through a body that had long grown cold. The words repeated again and again, each time sounding less impossible than before, as disbelief slowly gave way to something fragile and bright. Still alive. The thought alone made his chest tighten, breath catching as emotions he had carefully sealed away began to leak through the cracks. For days no, for far longer than that, he had lived with the quiet certainty that he would die on this platform, that the universe had already decided his ending and simply delayed the moment of execution. He had made peace with it. He had told himself that acceptance was strength. But now that strength wavered. His vision blurred, not from fear, but from relief so sudden and overwhelming that his mind struggled to contain it, tears welling despite his attempts to steady himself as the weight he had carried alone finally began to lift. I'm not done, he thought, as his body trembled from excitement. However, before he could fully even begin to process that thought, Leo was already there beside him, ready to break his chains. Ver thought confused, as he barely registered the distance being crossed, only that Leo suddenly stood before him, close enough that he could see the exhaustion beneath the calm, the dried blood along his armor, and the quiet certainty in his eyes that made the world feel real again, as Leo reached for the first chain. Crack! The restraint shattered cleanly, dissolving into nothing as freedom returned to Ver's arm, the sensation light and almost unreal, like waking from a dream he hadn't known he was still trapped in. Then the second crack, and the third crack. Each chain fell away without pain, without resistance, as if the universe itself had already accepted that this execution was over, that the verdict had been overturned. Ver remained silent throughout, lips parted but voice lost somewhere beneath the rush of emotions flooding his chest, his hands trembling faintly as he watched Leo work with quiet efficiency. When the fourth and final chain broke, crack, Ver finally found the strength to lift his head. He looked at Leo then, truly looked at him, eyes shining and unguarded, expression stripped of pride, fear, and doubt alike, leaving behind only something raw and pure. "You came for me, brother." The words broke as they left him, voice cracked and uneven, as those speaking them made the moment real at last. Leo blinked, then raised an eyebrow slightly, a small, gentle smile tugging at the corner of his lips as he glanced past Ver, toward the cult army now surging toward the platform in a tide of devotion and fury. "Of course I did," he said calmly, turning his gaze back to Ver. "We all did." He gestured lightly toward the approaching figures, his voice steady and warm. "You're our dragon, no." As in that moment, standing free beneath a broken sky, Ver realized he wasn't alone anymore, that he wasn't an orphan anymore. He was Aegon Ver of the cult. He was the dragon. Meanwhile, Raymond. Meanwhile, as Leo shattered Ver's bounds, Raymond quietly stirred. Nearby, the strain of sustaining the Chakravia for so long had left the demigod's body in revolt, every circuit aching in every breath shallow, as he forced himself upright through sheer stubbornness, rather than strength. Wobble. His legs trembled beneath him, vision swimming for a moment before he steadied himself, jaw tightening as humiliation burned hotter than the pain. He watched the final chain fall. Watched Ver finally be free. And something ugly twisted inside his chest. Fury surged, raw and unfiltered, drowning out the lingering dizziness. As his nails dug into his palms hard enough to draw blood, the sight before him offending something fundamental he believed in. "How dare you try to free my prisoner?" Raymond thought, teeth grinding together as his aura stirred in response to his anger, flickering unsteadily but violently all the same. "How dare you try to overturn divine order?" His gaze locked onto Leo, hatred sharpening his focus as the weight of what had just occurred finally settled in. Leo rescuing Ver was not a simple affair. For the cult to arrive on the pit and save Ver with the whole universe watching, was not merely a rescue, but a public humiliation of the universal government itself, a blatant slap to its authority and honor so severe that no amount of propaganda or retaliation could ever fully erase it. "This isn't over. Not yet," Raymond thought, as he forced himself fully upright, spine straightening as his pride refused to let him remain kneeling any longer, even if his body screamed in protest. "You think you're strong because you killed a few mortals." The thought curdled into contempt as his eyes flicked briefly toward the wreckage of the fourth ring, bodies scattered like discarded tools. "I'll show you what real power looks like." His lips curled into a thin, venomous smile, resolve hardening as fury replaced exhaustion. "I'll crush your dreams before you can finish building them, just to remind the universe that the universal government is not weak, that I, Raymond, am not weak." Chapter 956 Top Priority. Meanwhile, across righteous faction worlds, common civilian POV. Across the countless worlds governed by the righteous faction, the execution livestream continued to play without interruption, projected onto massive public screens, orbital relays, and household displays alike, as trillions of citizens bore witness to a moment that was sure to quietly and irrevocably fracture their belief in the order they had grown up trusting. At first, disbelief reigned. As they watched Leo step onto the execution platform and break the first chain, something unseen yet deeply ingrained began to crack within their collective psyche, as the image of absolute righteous authority faltered under the weight of undeniable reality. Gasps, murmurs, muted talking, whispers rippled through gathered crowds and private living rooms alike, voices low and uncertain, as eyes remained locked on the screen. "What's going on?" Someone tell me the evil cult isn't really about to succeed. Yet no one answered them, because no one could. Despite trillions of them praying for the cult to fail, the fact remained that Leo continued to move freely, unchallenged and unopposed, as no divine enforcers descended from the heavens to correct the situation. Is this the end of the universal order as we once knew? It was no longer a dramatic thought, but a logical one, as an unsettling pattern emerged with each passing second, eroding certainty the longer the execution proceeded without correction. Why was no one stopping him? Soren was only one god. Leo was only one warrior. And yet, together, they had shattered an execution overseen by the universal government itself, tearing through elite formations that were supposed to be untouchable, unstoppable, and final. How can this be happening? A merchant on a righteous trade world murmured, his voice shaking despite himself, as he watched chain after chain fall apart. If this is allowed, then who exactly is protecting us? If this is allowed, then can we even trust the righteous faction to maintain universal order? If they can't even execute one criminal, can they even keep us safe anymore? He questioned, as his words made many faces stiffen. Clank, clank. As Ver's final restraints collapsed and the cult dragon finally began to rise, the disbelief curdled into something far more dangerous than panic, as a realization silently spread through the minds of those watching. If this could happen here, under full surveillance, against the full authority of the righteous faction, then the image of invincibility they had relied on for generations was nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. If this war is any indication of what comes next, a scholar whispered on a distant academic world, his gaze distant and hollow, then the cult will soon not just be resisting us anymore. They will push back and expand. And if they choose to do so, who exactly is going to stop them? He wondered, as military veterans, analysts, and ordinary citizens alike began to notice the same troubling pattern, as footage replayed across the universe, showing cult warriors moving with discipline and resolve, while righteous elites faltered, hesitated, and collapsed beneath pressure they were never meant to endure. Our armies don't fight the same way, a former officer admitted quietly, more to himself than anyone else. At the same tier, our people look weaker, slower, almost like they are less prepared for wars that don't follow traditional rules, he said, as he realized that the years where the righteous army dominated universal peace were gone. Meanwhile, Ruvasa's POV. If there was one thing Ruvasa despised more than watching the Chakravia collapse inward on itself and being forced to chase Soren across the third dimension, it was being forced to do so alongside 7 other morons, as she found herself increasingly baffled by just how petty, disorganized, and fundamentally incompetent her so-called peers truly were. Just how long does it take to corner one man? She wondered bitterly, irritation simmering beneath her calm exterior, as her thoughts drifted back to the reasons she had been dragged into this mess in the first place, each one more unpleasant than the last. I'm tired, I'm grumpy, and I would very much prefer to be doing literally anything else right now, she thought sourly, but of course, I don't get that luxury. Since the moment the great clans had signed the subservice agreement, their autonomy had become conditional, binding them to the universal government's whims whenever Soren was involved, as whether they liked it or not, they were expected to assist in eliminating him whenever the situation escalated beyond control. And today, it had escalated, which in itself should have been sufficient reason for her to help. However, it still wasn't the only one. Because beyond the inescapable obligation, there was also something far more fundamental at play, something Ruvasa understood better than most of the others chasing alongside her. For she understood that Soren, and him alone, was the cult of Ascension's spine, its shield and its sole reason for relevance. While no one else truly mattered. For gods like them, it did not matter whether the cult followers numbered in the dozens or in the hundreds of millions, because without a defender of Soren's caliber standing at their head, they could be erased with a flick of intent. Which was precisely why the cult dragons, the cult army, and even the demon of Omega himself barely registered as priorities. For they were nothing more than symptoms, while Soren was the disease. And as far as the great clans were concerned, once Soren fell, everything else would collapse naturally, the cult crumbling into irrelevance without its cornerstone, as that was the logic they operated under. Cold, efficient, and dangerously oversimplified. Which was why, despite the cult army being out there, they only focused on killing Soren first. As for them, nothing else truly mattered. So long as Soren remained alive, every victory against the cult would be temporary, every suppression incomplete, and every so-called triumph nothing more than a delay. Kill Soren, and the cult would wither on its own. Fail to do so, and no amount of soldiers, propaganda, or executions would ever truly end it. Which was why he had to go down first. Chapter 957 The Dance of a Broken Cult Master. Meanwhile, Leo, while Ver slowly pushed himself back onto his feet and the cult army rushed forward to greet their dragon, Leo scanned the surroundings with sharp, measured focus, because unlike the others, he understood that this war was far from over. It's not over until I get everyone back to Ixtal safely, Leo thought, as his gaze settled on Clarence's unconscious body lying helplessly a few hundred meters away. If this were any other day, I'd probably take the chance to get rid of you while you're knocked out, but unfortunately today's not that day, he thought, as he clicked his tongue and shifted his attention, eyes moving toward Terence, who, though not unconscious, was barely holding himself together, the demigod locked in an awkward plank-like posture as he struggled to rise. Not good. With divine regeneration, he'll be back on his feet in a minute or two. Probably ready for combat in 3 or 4. Leo realized grimly, as his heartbeat quickened. That's nowhere near enough time to evacuate the cult army, he thought, as his grip tightened around his daggers, the intention being to strike Terence while he still held the advantage when suddenly, a thick, suffocating killing intent locked onto him from the left. Leo turned toward the source instinctively, only to find Raymond forcing himself upright, the demigod's expression twisted with naked hatred, his battered body clearly struggling, yet his will unmistakably set on continuing the fight. Oh, fuck no, Leo thought darkly. Why is it always the slimiest bastards who recover the fastest? He wondered as he shifted his stance immediately, angling his body toward Raymond as his posture hardened, every muscle coiling in preparation for war. All units, prepare to board the craft and evacuate. Leo roared, his voice cutting through the battlefield. I repeat, all units, prepare to board the craft and evacuate. Carry the injured. Run as fast as you can. I want everyone boarded and ready to leave this planet within 10 minutes. The cult army froze for half a second before snapping into motion. The unbridled joy on the soldiers' faces vanished instantly as panic replaced celebration, the urgency in the Shadow Dragon's voice leaving no room for doubt. What's going on? Why does the Lord sound so tense? The common soldiers whispered among themselves, unable to see what Leo could, as they remained unaware of the threat now looming over them. You sick bastard, Leo thought, jaw clenching as his eyes traced the web of intent lines branching out from Raymond's body. Some converged directly on him, but far more spread outward, toward the cult army, as if Raymond were deliberately forcing him into a choice, where he could save only one of the 3. What will it be, distant cousin? Raymond muttered, divine essence beginning to pool violently within his circuits. Who do you lose first? Your followers, your dragon, or your life? He asked, as Leo immediately lowered himself into a brace posture, ready to handle anything that Raymond threw at him next. Meanwhile while Leo saved Ver, Soren began fighting the last and probably the most important battle of his life, as he harnessed the power of the 4th dimension and bent time according to his will. The world ceased to behave like a place governed by rules the moment he did, as distance folded inward and outward at the same time, as moments overlapped and reordered themselves, and as the concept of before and after lost all meaning in the space surrounding him. 7 gods struck at once. Axes fell before they were swung, blades arrived after they had already missed, and divine techniques detonated in places Soren had never occupied, as the battlefield fractured into layered versions of itself, each one real, each one false, and all of them answering to Soren alone. He moved without moving. To Helmuth's eyes, Soren vanished. To Morris, he split into 3. To the others, he was everywhere and nowhere, his silhouette trailing through time like an echo that refused to fade, as attacks carved through afterimages that had already ceased to exist. A hammer crushed the ground where Soren would have stood, shattering mountains and rupturing continents, yet Soren was already stepping out of the moment before that strike landed, his footfall echoing backward through causality as he reappeared behind another god entirely. Slash. The sound arrived late. Blood followed even later, spraying from a shoulder that had not yet realized it had been cut, as Caliph staggered in confusion, senses failing to reconcile the order of events. Gah, na. Soren laughed. It was not loud, nor was it cruel, but it was free, as his battered body finally found something it had been denied for centuries: space to breathe, room to act, and enemies worthy of his full attention. Every injury he carried screamed in protest, origin poison gnawing at his veins, muscles burning under centuries of accumulated damage, yet none of it mattered now, as pain required time to exist, and time no longer belonged to anyone but him. Shoom. A spear pierced his chest. Or rather, it would have. However, the moment rewound itself half a heartbeat, the weapon phasing through where his heart had been before he twisted reality sideways, as Soren's hand closed around the shaft in a version of the present that should not have existed, snapping it cleanly before driving its broken end through the Yukiro's throat in another. Splat. Space screamed. The fourth dimension folded like silk, stretching, compressing, looping over itself as Soren wove through it with terrifying elegance, every step rewriting probability, every breath pulling the battlefield deeper into unreality. As the seven gods surrounding him began to panic, formations dissolved, coordination failed, attacks collided with one another mid-execution, detonating in cascades of divine backlash as Soren forced them to dance to tempos they could not hear, let alone follow. He smiled wider. This is it, he thought, watching a city-sized shockwave freeze mid-expansion before shattering backward into its caster. My last act. And since it was his last, he decided he would enjoy it, savoring every distorted second, every widened eye, every moment of helpless realization blooming across the faces of those who had believed him broken long ago. As at this moment, he thought of his father. He thought of betrayal. He thought of centuries spent bleeding quietly so others could pretend they ruled a just universe. As a single conclusion rose in his mind. You can cheat me. You can gang up on me. You can betray me. But you will never break me. Nor shall you ever have the satisfaction of defeating me. You killed my father through deceit. And 2,250 years later, still, none of you is strong enough to touch his heels. So for my last act, just for the next few minutes, I'll show you the true fighting style my father taught me. The one he began, and the one I perfected. This is not the timeless assassin's dance. This is my dance. The dance of a broken cult master. Chapter 958 Flashback. A few days earlier, Planet Ixtal, Leo and Soren's POV. Steam rising. Sunlight pouring through tinted glass. Soren sat across from Leo with a warm teacup cradled in his hands, thin wisps of steam curling upward as golden light spilled through the windows and painted half his face in soft warmth, while the other half remained steeped in shadow, thoughtful and unreadable. He listened without interruption, eyes lowered to the surface of the tea as though the answer might be waiting there. Think about it, cult master, Leo said steadily, leaning forward just enough to show conviction without urgency. If you cut open a pathway to the fourth dimension at exactly 94.44 degrees from the heart of the pit, you'll find Multheric waiting on the other side, already coiled and prepared. Soren's brow twitched almost imperceptibly. As long as you can trick one of the gods into stepping through, Leo continued, voice calm but intent, then that should be enough. Multheric will do the rest. The suggestion hung in the air between them, bold to the point of recklessness, as Soren remained silent, lifting the cup to his lips and taking a slow sip, the heat grounding him as his mind raced through possibilities, angles, risks, and inevitable failures. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the faint clink of porcelain. Then he exhaled, long and measured, lowering the cup as he cleared his throat. I'll give you this, kid, Soren said at last, a faint, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. It's a very bold and creative plan. He ran a hand through his hair, fingers dragging back as though trying to physically push the thought away. But forcing a god into a portal he doesn't want to enter is not exactly a casual maneuver, he continued, his tone turning more serious. Especially not when I'll be handling 7 opponents at the same time. Soren leaned back slightly, gaze drifting toward the window as if remembering past battles fought against other gods. You see, god-level combat doesn't happen cleanly in the third dimension, he said quietly. It takes place between the third and the fourth, right at the boundary where reality stops being cooperative. He glanced back at Leo. Time doesn't behave normally there. And if I stop for even a fraction too long to shove someone into a portal, that single action will cost me everything else. His fingers tightened faintly around the cup. I'd be trading one move for my life, Soren said bluntly. 6 other attacks would land in that same instant. That much I'm sure of. The admission settled heavily, as Soren searched his own thoughts for a workaround, for some clever inversion or loophole that might make the plan safer. However, unfortunately for him, he found none at this moment. I won't promise you I can pull this off, he said at last, meeting Leo's eyes fully now. What I can promise though, is that I'll try. Leo remained silent, listening. Just try for it, Cult Master. If you can. Soren recalled Leo speaking, as oddly, looking back at that conversation now, he could not help but smile even wider. Step. Dodge. Shatter. Weaving through the attacks of 7 opponents, he continued to move towards the heart while leading 7 opponents on, as at this moment, he finally saw a solution for 2 of the biggest problems weighing down on his mind for the past several days. I finally see it. I finally see a way to pass on the Grudgekeeper set and push Helmuth into the 4th dimension. Soren thought, as in a rare moment of enlightenment, he figured out a sequence of attacks through which he could possibly achieve the impossible. Leo Skyshard, you crazy lad. Oh, how I wish I could have met you just a few centuries earlier. Perhaps if we met back then, I would not have to die after this fight. Perhaps if we met back then I would have been fortunate enough to watch you rebuild the cult with my own eyes. Alas, fate has not been so kind to me, he thought, as a tiny tear formed at the edge of his eyes. His lips smiling, however, his heart aching, as he realized that he only had a few more minutes of his body being able to support him at this tier, before it shut down forever. Chapter 959 Dilemma. Meanwhile, Yukiro's POV. After Soren drove the shattered shaft of Yukiro's own spear straight into his face, it took him several disoriented seconds to realign his vision, blood and divine essence blurring the world as his senses struggled to catch up to reality. And in that brief moment of clarity, Yukiro finally understood. The figure standing before them was no longer the battered, decaying cult master worn down by centuries of poison and attrition. This was Soren as he once was. The most gifted son of the timeless assassin. The monster who had once dominated the universe in his prime. Everything about his fighting style had shifted. Gone was the cautious, defensive rhythm Soren had adopted against Helmuth earlier, where every movement had been measured, restrained, and conservative. As now, he was relentless. Aggressive. Utterly unbothered by the fact that he stood alone against 8 gods, as though the numerical disadvantage was an inconvenience at best, and irrelevant at worst. Even after centuries, even after all that damage, Yukiro thought grimly, he's still as sharp as ever. He admitted begrudgingly, as he saw Soren perform the impossible, as he dodged a strike from Dutrask, before then countering in a way where reality altered the trajectory of his attack, as a heartbeat later. Blood appeared across Dutrask's forearm, origin metal having already done its work by the time the pain arrived. Gah! Dutrask screamed, staggering back as the wound refused to close, flesh rejecting regeneration entirely as the poison of origin metal settled in with cruel permanence, as Yukiro could not help but wince despite himself. Thank the heavens, he thought darkly. If it had been his origin blades instead of my own spear that pierced me earlier, I wouldn't be standing here right now. He realized, as that understanding hardened his resolve. From that point onwards, Yukiro consciously kept his distance from Soren, as he abandoned any thought of close engagement and instead unleashed long-range spear attacks, divine essence detonating across the battlefield in violent succession. Boom! Kaboom! Blast! The planet trembled beneath their exchange, tectonic plates screaming as mountains warped and terrain permanently deformed, yet no matter how many attacks rained down, Soren remained untouched, weaving through destruction as though the world itself was moving too slowly to reach him. I don't understand how he does it. Yukiro thought, frustration and envy twisting together. The timeless assassin did the same thing. We're all gods, but our control over time is non-existent compared to theirs. His mind latched onto the answer with reluctant clarity. Movement. That was the difference. The ability to walk between the seconds, to exist in the cracks between moments, was what made Soren, and his father before him, so terrifying. Without it, Yukiro knew, Soren would be formidable yet manageable, yet, with it, he was simply untouchable. Clang *clang. Slash. Unwilling to decipher the early warnings, it was Helmuth and Ruvasa who charged in next, fury and pride driving them forward despite the glaring red flags, as Soren met their attacks cleanly, deflecting both in a single fluid exchange, before then continuing his movement to land a counter. Splat! His blade kissed Ruvasa's side in a shallow arc, slicing across her hip with deceptive gentleness as blood sprayed thinly from beneath her armor, the cut small in size but infinite in consequence, as Ruvasa froze in disbelief, pupils contracting. Her expression darkened as the pain settled in, her lips thinning into a frown as she realized that this wound was never going to heal. Fuck, she muttered, retreating instinctively as she pressed a hand to her side, only to be horrified when blood pooled in her fingers. That bastard cut me, he said, as the divine essence separated into 3 attack paths. Slash, slash, slash. 3 distinct arcs of intent peeled away from Raymond's blade, each one sharp enough to slice an ocean by itself, as each one carried with it a different promise of loss. One cut bent outward, wide and indiscriminate, its trajectory fanning toward the densest cluster of the cult army, where injured soldiers and medics were still scrambling to board the nearest evacuation craft, utterly defenseless against a strike of that magnitude. While the second was narrow and precise. Its path locked cleanly onto Leo's throat, the killing intent behind it cold and absolute, as though Raymond had already decided that this was the moment he would end the biggest nuisance of this war. While the third curved slightly, almost lazily, its edge humming with cruel deliberation as it aligned itself with Ver's chest, aimed not to kill instantly, but to cripple, to remind him exactly where he stood in the hierarchy of gods and prisoners. As in that frozen heartbeat, Leo understood. Raymond was not attacking to win. He was attacking to force a choice. Save the army, save the dragon, or save himself. And no matter what Leo chose, Raymond intended to take something from him. Chapter 960 Mocking Leo. Leo watched the 3 attacks peel away from Raymond's blade in diverging arcs of annihilation, as time seemed to stretch thin under the weight of inevitability. And in that stretched instant his mind tore through countless possibilities with ruthless clarity, stripping away hope, heroism, and fantasy until only the truth remained. I don't have enough time to save everyone here, he realized, as the vectors and trajectories burned themselves into his vision and the gap between what he wanted to do and what he could do became brutally apparent. If Ver falls now, after everything we sacrificed to free him, the army won't just lose a dragon, they will lose morale and a sense of purpose. It will be as though we fought this entire war for naught. And hence, no matter what, I can't let him die at the least. Leo thought, as his body moved before doubt could poison his decision, as he stepped into the oncoming violence rather than away from it, planting his foot forward with deliberate force as his torso twisted upward, daggers flashing as he met the first arc head-on. Clang, parry, swoosh. Redirecting the first arc skyward, he produced a brutal deflection that sent the heavens screaming as the redirected slash tore a wound through the clouds. Screech. Pushback. The recoil slammed through his arms instantly, as bone rattled and muscle screamed, yet he did not pause, as he rolled through the backlash with practiced precision, momentum carrying him low and forward as the second arc curved toward Ver, its edge humming with intent, as Leo rose into it with a full-body brace, channeling everything he had into a single point. Enhance, he triggered internally, as power flooded his limbs in a violent surge, as his stance locked, spine aligned and feet dug into shattered earth. Clang. FSHHHHH. Despite his best attempts to redirect this attack skyward as well, the angle and power behind this strike made it difficult for him to do so, as in the end he was forced to block it traditionally, the divine force pressing against mortal will, as his entire frame bent under a pressure that would have crushed an average monarch outright. Block. Boom. The impact detonated outward, as the ground beneath him caved and fractured, a massive shockwave rippling around the execution platform area, as blood burst from his knuckles and nose alike. Splat. Drip drip. Yet, despite the minor injuries, the important bit for him was that he had been successful in blocking the 2 attacks, and that Ver was still unharmed. However, even as he did so, he knew that the third had already found its mark. Screams. Bodies splitting in half asterisk. Far from him, the widest slash continued unimpeded toward the retreating cult army, as evacuation lines broke into chaos and as millions looked up only to find death already upon them. the divine slash arriving without spectacle or mercy as it erased everyone in its path. Swoosh! The slash passed through them like a silent judgment. Entire legions vanished in an instant, bodies severed mid-stride, transports cleaved cleanly in half, blood atomized into crimson mist, as roughly 12 million soldiers were wiped from existence in a single motion, their final screams cut short so abruptly that the silence afterward felt wrong. Blood river. Bodies twitching at the door of death. The aftermath was horrific. Fields once crowded with living bodies became layered carpets of severed limbs and armor shards, as half-corpses collapsed in delayed realization, while smoke rose from cauterized wounds and the stench of iron and scorched flesh overwhelmed the air. Plop. Uzi. Blood continued to ooze from dead bodies as the ground soaked so thoroughly that it reflected the broken sky above. Leo stood there trembling, his chest heaving as pain finally caught up to him all at once, while the weight of the choice he had made pressed down heavier than any divine attack ever could. Behind him, the cult army screamed, their voices fracturing under the combined weight of grief and disbelief as horror rippled uncontrollably through their ranks. He had saved himself. He had saved Ver. And 12 million lives had paid the price for that choice. You sick bastard. Leo thought, rage pooling inside him as he straightened slowly, blood dripping from his chin and fingers alike, as his eyes hardened with something far colder than anger. You will pay the price for this. I will make sure you don't leave this battlefield alive today, even if that's the last thing I do. Leo swore internally, as his killing intent flared, his emotions heightening his aura strength, as Raymond chuckled out loud looking at his enraged expression. Na. The demigod chuckled, as he pointed a finger towards Leo, before then pointing towards the millions dead beside him, as he tried to bait Leo into a rage-filled charge. Look at those dead foolish mortals. Did you really think they're tough? Just because they trampled through some weaker mortals and managed to reach the core? Because, no, they're not tough. They're ants, just like most of existence. If I wanted to kill them all, it wouldn't even take me a full 30 minutes. Hell, I could probably destroy this entire planet in a couple hours if I really wanted to. Raymond began, as he spread his arms and raised his chin. But since you are related to me by blood, I will give you a chance. Skyshard. A chance to save the lives of millions more. And all you have to do is kneel before me and acknowledge the fact that this whole war was a wasted effort. I want you to get down on your knees and beg. Beg for the life of your men. Beg for the life of your dragon. And accept the glorious death I bestow upon you like it's the most mercy you have ever received. And maybe, just maybe, if I'm satisfied after all that, I might consider sparing them all. Raymond offered, as he looked down on Leo with nothing but contempt in his eyes. For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.